Hey everyone! Tonight we are stepping back into a world where the sea doesn't just represent a journey or a trade route, but a literal highway to hell. Imagine you are standing on the deck of a wooden ship in the middle of the night, the salt air stinging your eyes, and out of the darkness comes a sound like 1,000 angry hornets, followed by a wall of liquid flame that turns the very water beneath you into a burning carpet. You are about to witness the ultimate secret weapon of the Middle Ages. A chemical nightmare so terrifying that its exact recipe died with the empire that birthed it. It's the kind of situation where you realize pretty quickly that your heavy iron armor is basically just an oven, and you probably wouldn't survive this if you were on the receiving end. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, so go ahead and drop your location and your local time in the comments. It's always cool to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the damp, salt-slicked deck of a Byzantine dromon, a sleek, predatory galley that cuts through the choppy waters of the Golden Horn like a knife. It's the late 7th century, and the air is thick with more than just the smell of the sea. There's a tension here, a vibration in the wood beneath your feet that tells you the world is about to change. To your left and right, the great city of Constantinople looms, its massive Theodosian walls glowing pale under a waning moon. But your eyes aren't on the city, they are fixed on the horizon, where the massive fleet of the Umayyad Caliphate sits like a dark forest of masts, waiting for the first light of dawn to finish what they started. They've come to erase your world, to break the Queen of Cities, and they have every reason to believe they'll succeed. After all, they have the numbers, the momentum, and the will. What they don't have is the secret currently being loaded into the prow of your ship. As you walk toward the front of the vessel, you see men moving with a strange, jittery caution. They aren't handling crates of grain or spare oars. They are maneuvering heavy bronze-clad siphons and sealed ceramic jars that smell faintly of turpentine and something much darker, something ancient and oily. This is the ghost ship moment. To the enemy watching from a distance, your ship looks like any other Roman galley. They don't see the complex array of pumps and bellows hidden beneath the forecastle. They don't know that inside those bronze tubes, a chemical cocktail is waiting to be pressurized. You lean against the rail, watching the mist roll off the water, and you realize that in a few hours, the guys on those Arab ships are going to experience a level of sensory overload that their brains are uneven wired to process yet. Historically, this is the period where the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, if you're a stickler for labels, was essentially backed into a corner. They had lost Egypt, they had lost Syria, and now the heart of the empire was under a chokehold. The mainstream historical fact here is that without the invention of Greek fire during this specific siege, Western history would look fundamentally different. Constantinople was the gateway, and that gateway was currently being kicked in. But as you watch the crew prime the pumps, you notice something quirky. Some of the sailors are wearing tunics treated with vinegar, and there's a rumor whispered among the rowers that the oil used in the mixture comes from wells of eternal fire in the east, where the earth itself bleeds black. It's a bit of fringe lore, but in the flickering torchlight, it feels entirely plausible. You watch a man at the prowess specialist, not a regular soldier, check the seal on a large copper boiler. Historians still argue whether the mixture was actually preheated before being fired, or if the friction of the pump provided enough energy to ignite it, but as you stand there, you can feel a distinct heat radiating from the machinery. It's a low, pulsing warmth that feels out of place in the cool morning air. The crew isn't talking much. There's a solemnity to their movements, almost like a religious ritual. They know that if they drop a torch or if a seal leaks, this ship doesn't just sink, it becomes a bonfire that the water won't extinguish. You're essentially standing on top of a 7th century fuel tank made of wood and pitch. It's a miracle anyone volunteered for this job, honestly. The sun begins to peek over the horizon, casting a long, bloody streak across the water. The enemy fleet begins to move. You can hear the rhythmic beat of their drums, a sound that usually signals the end for whatever city is in their path. You see the massive line of ships, hundreds of them, beginning their sweep toward the harbor. Your captain gives a low, calm signal. No trumpets, no shouting. The rowers pull with a steady, practiced gait, bringing your dromon out to meet the vanguard. You feel the ship lurch forward. You're not charging to ram them, you're positioning. You re-angling the bronze lion's head at the prowess decorative piece that masks the nozzle of the siphon to face the lead enemy vessel. There's a moment of profound silence as the distance closes. You can see the faces of the sailors on the opposing ship now. They are preparing their boarding grapples. They are readying their archers. They expect a standard naval engagement, a collision of wood, a storm of arrows, and a bloody struggle on the decks. They have no idea that the rules of engagement were rewritten last night in a laboratory. You see the man at the pump take a deep breath. He looks at the captain, who nods. A small pilot light, a tiny flickering flame at the end of a long pole, is held near the mouth of the bronze lion. Then comes the sound. It's not a bang. It's a deep, guttural roar, like the earth itself is clearing its throat. A jet of shimmering, amber-colored liquid shoots out from the lion's mouth, instantly erupting into a terrifying, concentrated stream of fire. It doesn't dissipate in the air like a campfire flame. It holds its shape, a lance of roaring heat that spans the gap between the ships and a heartbeat. You watch, transfixed, as the liquid hits the wooden hull of the enemy ship. It doesn't just burn the wood, it splashes. It flows like flaming water, coating the deck, the sails, and the men who happen to be standing in its path. The psychological shift is instantaneous. 1 second, the enemy is shouting battle cries. The next, there is a collective haunting scream that cuts through the roar of the flames. You see men jumping into the sea to escape the heat, only to realize to their absolute horror that the fire is following them. It floats. It stays lit on the surface of the salt water, creating a ring of fire around the sinking ship. This is the moment where naval warfare stops being about tactics and starts being about pure, unadulterated terror. You're looking at the first real horror show of the Middle Ages, and as your ship banks to find its next target, you realize you're no longer just a passenger. You read a witness to the secret that will keep this empire alive for another 700 years. As the smoke from that first devastating blast drifts across your face, tasting of sulfur and burnt resin, your mind drifts back to how this nightmare began. You aren't just looking at a weapon, you're re-looking at the desperation of a man who watched his home burn and decided to give the world a taste of its own medicine. This brings us to the shadowy figure of Kallinikos of Heliopolis. He wasn't a general or a high-born noble. He was a Jewish Syrian architect and chemist who fled the Arab conquest of his homeland. You can imagine him arriving at the gates of Constantinople, dust-covered and frantic, clutching the most dangerous secret in the Mediterranean. He didn't come with gold or armies. He came with a recipe that would effectively freeze time for the Byzantine Empire. Historians still argue whether Kallinikos invented the substance entirely on his own, or if he simply refined an older, forgotten Roman incendiary known as Medea's oil. Some suggest he may have even spent time in the East, learning the properties of rock oil from local Persian traditions. But as you watch him in your mind's eye, working in a damp, torchlit cellar, under the watchful eyes of the emperor's secret police, the distinction doesn't really matter. He was a refugee who weaponized his trauma. To the Byzantines, he was a godsend. To their enemies, he was a sorcerer who had made a pact with the devil. There's a quirky legend that Kallinikos chose the bronze lion as the nozzle shape because he believed the fire was the literal breath of the tribe of Judah, a bit of symbolic flair that added a layer of divine vengeance to the chemical carnage. You see him moving through the workshops, his hands stained with bitumen and his lungs scarred by the fumes of boiling sulfur. He's obsessed with the sticky quality of the flame. It's not enough for it to burn, it has to cling. You watch him experiment with different thickeners resins from the pine forests of the Black Sea, or perhaps even quicklime to ensure that any attempt to douse the fire with water would only trigger a violent exothermic reaction. It's the ultimate "I told you so" to the laws of nature. You realize that while the soldiers are the ones pulling the levers, the real war was won months ago in these silent, toxic laboratories. The mainstream historical consensus is that the arrival of Kallinikos in 672 AD was the single most important technological pivot point for the empire. Before him, the Byzantines were losing their naval supremacy. After him, they were untouchable for centuries. But being the keeper of such a secret was a death sentence in itself. You can almost feel the weight of the imperial guards standing at the door of his workshop. Kallinikos was a golden bird in a gilded cage. He was never allowed to leave the city. and his family was kept under constant surveillance to ensure the formula stayed within the walls of Constantinople. It's a bit of a grim reality check even. If you read the smartest person in the room, if your brain holds the keys to an empire, you're basically a high-value prisoner. You watch the crew of your ship handle the specialized ceramic jars he designed, which they call grenades. They're small, hand-sized pots filled with the liquid and a primitive wick. It's a light touch of irony that the man who designed these also built great architectural works. He understood how things were put together, which gave him the perfect insight into how to rip them apart. There's a fringe theory that the secret wasn't just the chemical mix, but the specific temperature at which it was kept. If it got too cold, it wouldn't flow. Too hot, and it would explode in the boiler. Kallinikos had to train a literal priesthood of fire tenders who knew the moods of the liquid. Imagine being one of those technicians. You're not a sailor, and you're certainly not a warrior. You're a chemist in a robe, standing in the middle of a naval battle, staring at a pressure gauge that didn't technically exist yet, trying to make sure the empire doesn't blow itself up. It's like being a nuclear engineer on a wooden raft. You see the stress in their eyes as the dromon lurches. If the ship tilts too far, the fire in the heating furnace might spill. If the pressure drops, the fire becomes a dribble that coats your own hull. It's a high-stakes game of chemistry where the loser does just lose the battle, they get erased from the map. As your ship turns to engage a second Arab vessel, you catch a glimpse of the emperor himself on a distant, larger galley. He's watching. He knows that the ghost of Kallinikos is the only thing standing between his daughters and a slave market. There is a psychological weight to this that's hard to overstate. Most medieval weapons were understood. Everyone knew how a sword worked, how an arrow flew, but this was the liquid of the Romans. It was something that seemed to defy the elements. You see the enemy commanders screaming orders, trying to get their ships to back away, but the dromons are too fast. The Byzantines have spent years refining the ships to match the weapon, creating a delivery system that is as much a part of the secret as the fire itself. You notice a small detail: the way the Syrian architect's influence extends even to the pipes. They are encased in leather and wool to prevent the liquid from losing heat as it travels to the nozzle. It's a masterpiece of ancient engineering. You realize that Kallinikos didn't just give them a weapon, he gave them a system. He turned the Byzantine navy into a professional technical force that operated on a level of complexity their rivals couldn't even imagine, let alone replicate. And yet, for all his genius, Kallinikos fades from the historical record almost immediately after his invention is deployed. He becomes a ghost in the machine, his name whispered in the palace but forgotten by the masses, who only see the fire. The sheer loneliness of being the man who invented hell on water must have been staggering. You wonder if he ever regretted it, standing on the walls and watching the horizon turn orange. Did he see himself as a savior? Or did he realize he'd just introduced a new kind of horror to the human experience? As you watch the second jet of flame erupt from your ship's prow, cutting through the rigging of a ship called the Star of the East, you can't help but think of the quiet man in the cellar. The fire is beautiful, in a terrifying way, a bright, neon orange that seems to vibrate against the blue of the Mediterranean. It's a chemical masterpiece, and you are currently standing on its canvas. You see the enemy sailors trying to use their shields to block the spray, but the liquid fire just flows around the metal, dripping onto their hands and feet. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we joked about in other historical contexts? Well, no amount of ancient skin protection is going to help you here. The sticky resin ensures that once it touches you, it's part of you. You watch as a group of boarders, once brave and organized, breaks into a panicked scramble, some throwing themselves overboard into the flaming water. It's a total collapse of discipline. The Syrian architect's revenge is complete, and the Golden Horn is slowly turning into a graveyard of charred timber and broken dreams. Now that you've seen the fire in action and met the man behind the curtain, we need to talk about the what of it all. You're standing on the deck, and the smell is really starting to get to you. It's not just smoke. It's a heavy, oily stench that sits in the back of your throat, like someone left a bucket of asphalt and pine sap to boil on a stove for 3 days. This brings us to the chemistry of the nightmare. If you were a spy trying to steal this recipe, you'd realize very quickly that the Byzantines weren't just using one ingredient. This was a sophisticated, multi-stage chemical cocktail. The main course of the mixture was almost certainly naphthalite, volatile crude oil that seeped naturally from the ground in places like the Crimean Peninsula and the Caucasus. It's the kind of stuff that makes modern gasoline seem like a gentle cousin, and the Byzantines had a steady supply of it flowing into their secret silos. But naphtha, on its own, is just a fuel. It burns too fast and thin. To turn it into a weapon of psychological collapse, you need it to be grabby. This is where the additives come in. As you watch the technicians stir the vats, you see them adding thickeners like pine resin, which acted as a medieval version of a polymer, giving the liquid a gooey, honey-like consistency. They likely added sulfur to lower the ignition point and create those distinctive, choking yellow clouds that blinded the enemy. The mainstream historical fact is that the exact formula was so well guarded that it remains one of the greatest lost technologies in history. We can replicate the effects today, but the precise ratios used in the 7th century are still a mystery. It's basically the Coca-Cola recipe of the ancient world, but instead of a refreshing beverage, it gives you third-degree burns. Then there's the trick ingredient that historians still argue about: quicklime. Some researchers believe the Byzantines figured out how to suspend calcium oxide in the oil. If that's true, it explains why the fire seemed to react so violently with water. In your mind, you can see a frustrated enemy sailor trying to throw a bucket of seawater onto a small patch of fire on the deck. Instead of going out, the fire snaps and hisses, the water triggering an exothermic reaction that actually spreads the flames. It's a bit of a quirky tidbit, but some fringe theories even suggest they might have added a bit of phosphorus or even saltpeter to ensure the flame was self-extinguishing. Imagine the absolute despair of the sailors realizing that the very ocean they relied on for safety had become an accelerant. You lean over the side of the dromon and see a patch of the liquid floating on the waves. It doesn't dissipate. It sits there like a glowing orange pancake, bobbing on the swells, while still putting out enough heat to blister the paint on a nearby hull. This floating property was the result of the specific density of the distilled naphtha. The Byzantines had essentially mastered the art of fractional distillation centuries before the rest of the world caught up. They weren't just throwing crude oil, they were throwing a refined, high-octane product that stayed on the surface. Historians still argue whether the mixture was ignited by a pilot light at the nozzle or if it was truly spontaneous upon contact with air or water, but watching it now, it feels like pure, harnessed magic. There is a certain irony in the fact that the Byzantines referred to this as sea fire or Roman fire, while the rest of the world eventually called it Greek fire. To the men on your ship, it's just the liquid. You watch a sailor carefully wipe a spill off his boot with a vinegar-soaked rag apparently. Vinegar was one of the few things that could cut through the oily residue. You probably wouldn't survive a direct hit, but even being near the spray is a gamble. The fumes alone are enough to make you lightheaded. It's a tactical masterpiece because it targets every sense. The blinding light of the naphtha, the sulfurous stench, the roar of the combustion, and the physical agony of the heat. It's a sensory overload designed to break the human spirit. You notice a small secondary vat near the main tank. It's filled with a darker, thicker sludge. A quirky bit of lore suggests that for night engagements, they would sometimes add different minerals to the mix to change the color of the flame, turning it a ghostly green or a deep blood red to further convince the enemy they were fighting demons rather than men. Whether that's true or just the result of chemical impurities, the effect remains the same. The science behind this wasn't just about heat, it was about persistence. Modern napalm is often cited as the closest equivalent, but Greek fire had a living quality to it, a way of flowing into the cracks of a ship, S-hull, and the joints of a man's armor that felt intentionally cruel. As you stand there, you realize the Byzantines were operating on a level of industrialized warfare that wouldn't be seen again for 1,000 years. They had a dedicated chemical corps, a specialized supply chain, and a naval architecture designed around a single volatile liquid. It's a far cry from the knights and swords image most people have of the Middle Ages. This was high-tech, high-risk, and higher-word. You see a technician checking the seals on the copper delivery pipes, his face illuminated by the pilot flame. He's not a warrior, but he holds more power than 100 archers. If he gets the pressure wrong, the pipe bursts and the ship becomes a floating coffin. If he gets it right, he erases an entire fleet. The complexity of the chemistry meant that the weapon was inherently anti-fragile. You couldn't just steal a jar of the stuff and use it. You needed the whole system: the pumps, the heaters, the nozzle, and the specialized training. This is why the secret stayed a secret for so long. Even if an enemy ship managed to capture a dromon, the crew was trained to scuttle the ship or dump the chemicals before they could be analyzed. It's the ultimate intellectual property protection. Historians still argue whether the secret was lost because the raw materials became unavailable, or because the Guild of Chemists, who knew the secret ratios, was wiped out during one of Constantinople's many internal coups. Looking at the glowing wake of your ship, you see the remnants of the chemical reaction, a shimmering, iridescent film on the water that looks almost like a spilled rainbow. It's beautiful, in a way, if you can ignore the fact that it just charred 50 men to cinders. It's a reminder that even in the darkest periods of history, human ingenuity can find ways to turn the Earth's most basic elements, oil, stone, and sap, into a force of nature. You can't help but wonder if the people who lived through this felt like they were witnessing the end of the world, or just the beginning of a new, much more dangerous one. The wind shifts, and for a second, the heat from the cooling pipes washes over you. You realize that the chemistry of the nightmare wasn't just about the fire itself. It was about the realization that no wall was thick enough and no ocean was wide enough to keep this stuff out. It turned the very environment against you. The water was no longer a shield, it was a conductor. The wind was no longer a friend, it was the breath that carried the fire. You're standing on the most advanced piece of technology in the world, and all you can think about is how fragile the human body is when faced with a few gallons of well-cooked bitumen. While the chemical cocktail is the soul of this weapon, the bronze siphon is its terrifying mechanical body. You walk toward the prow of the dromon, moving past the frantic rowers, and find yourself staring at the delivery system. It's not just a simple pipe, it's a masterpiece of 7th-century hydraulic engineering that looks more like something out of a steampunk fantasy than the early Middle Ages. You see a large, gleaming copper boiler sitting in a cradle of iron, connected to a series of hand-powered bellows and force pumps. The mainstream historical fact is that the Byzantines had actually preserved and refined the pneumatic principles of Hero of Alexandria, a Greek engineer from the 1st century, to create a pressurized flamethrower. They were using technology that the rest of Europe would even begin to grasp for another several hundred years. You watch 2 burly crewmen working the handles of the force pump. Their muscles are bulging, their faces slick with sweat, and the oily residue that seems to coat everything on this deck. They are essentially charging a battery of pressure. As they pump, the liquid is drawn from the sealed vats and pushed into a central chamber where it's compressed. You can hear the rhythmic clackus of the valves, a sound that would become a death knell for anyone within 100 yards. It's a delicate balance. If they pump too hard, the bronze joints might fail, spraying the interior of the ship with liquid death. If they pump too slowly, the stream won't have the reach to hit the enemy before they can ram you. It's a high-stakes workout where the consequence of a bad set is becoming a human torch. The nozzle itself is the most iconic part of the machine. It's often shaped like the head of a predatory beast, a lion, a dragon, or a snarling wolf. You reach out and touch the cold cast bronze of the lion's mane. The mouth of the beast is wide open, and inside, you can see the specialized swivel mechanism. This allowed the siphonator, the specialized officer in charge of the aim to track an enemy ship, even as the dromon swayed in the swells. Historians still argue whether these nozzles were equipped with a sophisticated universal joint, or if the entire assembly was simply mounted on a sturdy pivot. But the result was a weapon with a surprisingly high degree of accuracy. You're not just spraying fire, you're sniping with it. Here, as a quirky tidbit, some accounts suggest that the Byzantines actually used a primitive form of spark ignition near the nozzle, perhaps involving flint and steel triggered by a tripwire, though most scholars believe a simple pilot light was more common. Imagine the sheer nerve required to stand at the very front of a ship, holding a lit torch next to a hypersure nozzle filled with volatile naphtha, while enemy archers are trying to pin you to the deck. You probably wouldn't survive this if you had a nervous twitch. The siphonator has to be the coolest person on the ship. He waits until the very last second, when the enemy ship is close enough that he can see the whites of their eyes and the intricate carvings on their prow. Then he pulls the lever. The lion's roar isn't just a metaphor. When the valve opens, the pressurized liquid screams through the tube. Because the nozzle is slightly constricted, the liquid atomizes just enough to catch fire instantly, creating a focused, lance-like jet. You watch as the siphonator swivels the lion's head, painting the enemy deck with flame. It's not a single explosion, it's a continuous flowing stream that he can direct like a garden hose. This maneuverability was the key to its success. He can aim for the sails to demast the ship, or he can aim for the rowing ports, sending the fire down into the hull where the enemy rowers are trapped at their oars. It's a surgical application of chaos. You notice that the entire siphon assembly is encased in a protective wooden castle at the prow, shielded by thick hides soaked in vinegar and water. This wasn't just to protect the crew from arrows, it was a containment strategy. If the siphon leaked, the castle was designed to funnel the fire away from the rest of the ship. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines had a way to pulse the fire to save fuel, or if it was always one continuous, terrifying blast until the tank ran dry. Looking at the complex series of levers and stopcocks, it seems likely they had a level of control that would make a modern firefighter jealous. There's a fringe theory that the Byzantines actually used a double bellows system to ensure the pressure remained constant even when the pumps were between strokes. This would have required a level of mechanical synchronization that is staggering for the 600s AD. You see the firemaster watching the tension of the leather bellows, tapping a rhythm for the pumpers. It's like a deadly orchestra. The siphon wasn't just a tool, it was a living extension of the ship's intent. You realize that the Byzantines weren't just fighting with fire, they were fighting with mechanics. They had turned the raw primal element of fire into a calibrated mechanical output. As your ship prepares for another burn, you see the crew reloading the main boiler. They use specialized funnels and heavy leather gloves, treating the liquid with a kind of reverence modern soldiers give to unexploded ordnance. You remember that crocodile dung joke? Well, some of the sailors actually believe that certain foul-smelling ointments can protect them from the backspray of the siphon. It's probably just a placebo, but when you're standing 3 feet away from a bronze tube that's about to vomit a 1,000-degree jet of naphtha, you'll believe almost anything that makes you feel a little safer. The psychological impact of the siphon itself cannot be overstated. Long before the fire even hits, the sight of that bronze lion's head turning toward your ship must have been paralyzing. It was the red dot of a sniper rifle for the medieval world. You see an enemy galley desperately trying to backwater, their oars splashing in a frantic, uncoordinated mess. They know the range of the siphon. They know that if they can stay just 50 yards away, they might live, but the dromon is faster, sleeker, and more maneuverable. It's a predator designed specifically to bring the siphon into range. Standing there, you feel the hum of the pressurized chamber vibrating through the soles of your boots. It's a low-frequency growl that tells you the machine is ready. The siphonator grips the handles of the lion's head, his knuckles white. He's not looking at the fire, he's looking at the target. He is the master of the bronze lion, and in a few seconds, he's going to turn the sea into an oven. You realize that the siphon is the bridge between the ancient world of brute force and the modern world of industrial killing. It's as the moment the human race decided that fire did have to be a disaster. As the smoke clears from the latest engagement, you look back at the city behind you, and the sheer scale of the stakes finally sinks in. This isn't just a skirmish. You are currently a witness to the first Arab siege of Constantinople, a conflict that lasted from 674 to 678 AD. The massive Umayyad fleet has effectively occupied the waters around the capital, turning the Sea of Marmara into a hostile lake. For years they have wintered at Cyzicus, returning every spring like a recurring fever to batter the walls. The mainstream historical fact is that by 677, the situation for the empire was terminal. Their land armies were overstretched, and their conventional navy was being picked apart by the sheer numerical superiority of the caliphate's forces. The city was a head without a body, kept alive only by its massive walls and the grain ships that managed to run the blockade. You watch from the deck as the Byzantine Emperor, Constantine IV, orders the final, desperate gambit. He doesn't send out the whole navy, he sends out the fire-bearers. This is the moment the world first truly saw what Greek fire could do on a grand scale. To the Arab sailors, who had spent decades mastering the Mediterranean, naval war followed a predictable rhythm. You sail close, you shower the enemy with arrows, you ram, and you board. But as your dromon leads a small elite squadron out of the Golden Horn, you see the confusion in the enemy's ranks. They expect a desperate retreat. Instead, they are facing a calculated, aggressive charge. You see the massive Arab line begin to tighten, preparing to swallow your small fleet whole. Here is a quirky tidbit that often gets lost in the grand strategy. The Byzantines didn't just use fire, they used the weather. They waited for the meltemi winds to blow in just the right direction so that the smoke and the spray would be carried away from their own ships and directly into the faces of the attackers. It was a form of elemental synergy. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines had a secret way of predicting these winds or if they simply had the home field advantage of knowing every current in the Bosporus either way. As you feel the wind pick up, you see the Arab commanders realize too late that they are downwind of a chemical volcano. The smell of the sea is replaced by the suffocating stench of naphtha before a single spark is even struck. Imagine the perspective of an Arab sailor on the Al-Majid, a flagship in the center of the line. You've conquered North Africa and the Levant. You've seen every trick the Romans have. But then, you see this low-slung Byzantine gallieur dromon screaming toward you. You see a man standing at the prow, calmly adjusting a bronze tube. There's a sudden roar, a sound like the sky tearing open, and a jet of liquid light hits your mast. In seconds, the sail is gone. The fire doesn't just burn, it crawls. It moves down the rigging, like a living thing, dripping onto the deck. You probably wouldn't survive this because, in the 7th century, ships were essentially giant piles of seasoned wood, hemp rope, and linen, all of which have been waterproofed with highly flammable pitch. You are sitting on a tinderbox, and the Romans just handed you a sun. The horror show isn't just the fire itself. It's the realization that the rules of nature have been suspended. You see men trying to douse the flames with sand, a common tactic for small fires, but the sheer volume of the sea fire coming from the siphons is overwhelming. The Byzantine ships are dancing. They aren't staying to fight. They are darting in, delivering a sting of liquid flame, and then rowing backward with incredible speed. It's a Hitandran tactic that leaves the Arab fleet in a state of cascading chaos. Because the ships are packed so tightly together for mutual support, the fire from one ship quickly leaps to the next. The very formation designed to protect them has become their death warrant. There is a fringe theory that the Byzantines actually used decoy ships during this siege, vessels that looked like fire ships, but were actually empty, designed to lure the enemy into grouping up so the real dromons could flank them. Whether true or not, the psychological effect was a total paralysis of command. You see the Arab admiral's ship frantically trying to signal a retreat, but the flags are obscured by a thick, greasy black smoke that turns the afternoon into an artificial night. This is the moment historians point to when they say the tide of Islamic expansion was finally checked. If Constantinople had fallen in 678, the history of Europe would have been written in an entirely different script. As you stand on the dromon, you see the wreckage of the invincible fleet bobbing in the waves. The water is covered in a slick of unburned oil and charred timber. You see the bodies of men who chose the cold water over the heat, only to find the water itself was on fire. Historians still argue whether the Arab fleet's eventual retreat was due purely to the fire, or if a massive storm finished what the siphon started. But the psychological damage was done. They didn't just lose ships, they lost the belief that they could defeat the Roman magic. They stayed away for 40 years after this. 40 years of peace, bought with a few hundred gallons of distilled bitumen and a Syrian refugee's grudge. You watch the fire tenders on your ship begin the cooling process for the boilers. They are exhausted, their faces blackened by soot, looking more like coal miners than sailors. There's no cheering, no celebration, there's just a grim silence. They know what they've done. They've turned the sea into a graveyard. You remember that crocodile dung joke from earlier? Well, the men on the Arab ships probably would have traded every piece of gold they owned for a bucket of anything that could stop the burning. The sheer helplessness of the enemy is what sticks with you. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. As the dromon turns back toward the safety of the Golden Horn, you see the people of the city lining the walls. They are cheering, a distant sound like the humming of bees. They think a miracle has happened. They think God has reached down and struck the invaders with heavenly fire. You know better. You've seen the pumps, the bellows, and the sweaty men who make the miracle happen. You've seen the chemistry behind the divine intervention. You realize that the empire has survived not because of faith, but because it possessed the most terrifying technology on the planet. The sun begins to set, and the glow of the burning Arab ships on the horizon competes with the twilight. It's a beautiful, horrifying sight. You realize that you've just witnessed the birth of a legend. The Greek fire is no longer just a secret weapon. It is now the identity of the empire. It is the reason the city still stands. You lean back against the warm copper of the siphon housing, feeling the last of the pressure bleed out of the system with a long, weary sigh. The first siege is over, but the fire is just getting started. The battle might be over for today, but as you step down into the cramped, sweltering belly of the dromon, you realize that the real war is one of physics and nerves. You are standing in the engine room of the medieval world, and the heat down here is staggering. It's not just the ambient temperature of the Mediterranean, it's the radiating heat from the copper boilers that house the liquid fire. This brings us to the physics of the pressure cooker. To get that iconic long-range stream of fire, the Byzantines couldn't just pour the liquid out of a bucket. They had to turn the entire ship into a giant wooden syringe. The mainstream historical fact is that the Byzantine siphon used a force pump system, likely based on the designs of Ctesibius, which utilized a cylinder and piston mechanism to move the liquid under immense pressure. It was, quite literally, a 7th century pressure cooker, and you are standing right next to the valve. You watch the firemasters monitoring the copper tanks. They aren't looking at digital gauges, obviously. They are listening to the sound of the metal. They tap the sides of the boilers with small wooden mallets, listening for the change in pitch that tells them how much liquid is left and how much pressure has built up inside. It's a terrifyingly analog way to manage a high explosive environment. If the pressure exceeds the structural integrity of the copper ore, worse. The solder holding the pipes together, the entire forecastle of the dromon would vanish in a fireball of its own making. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines used a preheating furnace beneath the tanks to lower the viscosity of the naphtha, making it easier to spray, or if the heat was purely a byproduct of the chemical reaction or the friction of the pumps. As you feel the floorboards vibrating, you're inclined to believe there's a furnace down here somewhere, adding its own layer of stifling heat to the mix. There's a quirky tidbit here about the maintenance of these machines. Because the naphtha and resins were so corrosive and sticky, the entire siphon system had to be dismantled and cleaned with wine or strong vinegar after every engagement. Imagine being the lowest-ranking sailor on this ship, tasked with scrubbing the inside of a bronze tube that smells like a prehistoric swamp and a burnt pine forest. You probably wouldn't survive the long-term respiratory effects of this job. But in the 7th century, occupational health and safety wasn't exactly a priority. You're more concerned about the backfire, a fringe but terrifying possibility where the flame travels back up the stream of liquid and into the pressurized tank. To prevent this, the Byzantines used a series of check valves and flash guards that were centuries ahead of their time. You see a technician carefully applying a layer of animal fat to the leather gaskets of the pump. Everything in this room is about containment. You realize that the Byzantines' greatest achievement wasn't just the fire, but the metallurgy and seals required to hold it. Most contemporary civilizations could barely make a watertight barrel. The Byzantines were making airtight, pressurized copper delivery systems. It's a level of craftsmanship that feels alien compared to the Dark Ages happening in the rest of Europe. Historians still argue whether this technical knowledge was held by a specific guild of firemakers or if it was a closely guarded military secret, passed only from master to apprentice under an oath of blood. The physics of the stream itself is fascinating. To prevent the fire from simply billowing out into a useless cloud, the nozzle had to be shaped with extreme precision. You notice the siphonator above you calling for more heart from the pumpers. As the pressure builds, the liquid is forced through a narrow aperture, which causes it to atomize slightly at the edges while maintaining a solid core. This is why the fire looks like a physical spear. It has mass. When it hits an enemy ship, it doesn't just singe the wood. The force of the stream can actually knock men off their feet before the heat even registers. You're looking at a weapon that combines hydraulic force with thermal energy. Imagine the sheer physical toll on the men operating the pumps. They aren't just rowing, they are performing high-intensity interval training in a room that's basically a sauna filled with toxic fumes. You see a man collapse from exhaustion only to be immediately replaced by another. The rhythm of the pump is the heartbeat of the weapon. If the rhythm breaks, the pressure drops, the lance of fire falters, and the enemy, who are currently terrified, might find the courage to close the gap and board you. The physics of the weapon demands a level of human discipline that is just as rigorous as the chemical formula itself. There is a fringe theory that the Byzantines actually used a secondary air induction system near the nozzle to ensure that fire stayed lit even in high winds. It's the same principle as a modern Bunsen burner, mixing a bit of oxygen with the fuel at the point of ignition. Watching the way the flame roars, even when the dromon is moving at full speed, you can see why people thought it was supernatural. It feels like the machine is breathing. It's a living, angry thing. You remember that crocodile dung joke? Well, some sailors believe that if you rub the pipes with the fat of a fast-swimming fish, the liquid will flow faster. It's a strange mix of high-level engineering and low-level superstition that defines the Byzantine mind. As you move back toward the ladder to get some fresh air, you pass the cooling vats. These are large tubs of water used to soak the bronze pipes after a burn to prevent the metal from warping or becoming brittle from the extreme heat cycles. The sizzle of the hot bronze hitting the water creates a thick steam that fills the hold. You realize that the physics of the nightmare isn't just about the enemy's destruction. It's about the constant, grueling maintenance required to keep the dromon from destroying itself. The weapon is a double-edged sword that is constantly trying to melt its own handle. Historians still argue how many of these siphons a single dromon could carry. While the standard was one at the prow, some accounts suggest larger vessels had swivel siphons on the middeck, or even at the stern to discourage pursuit. Standing here, seeing the complexity of just one system, you realize the logistical nightmare of having 3 or 4 of these on a single wooden ship. It would turn the deck into a maze of pipes and boilers. But that's the Byzantine way. Complexity over simplicity, technology over numbers. They didn't need 1,000 ships if 10 of them could carry the power of a volcano. You finally reach the deck and take a deep breath of the salt air. It tastes like heaven compared to the oily metallic soup below. You look at the copper pipes protruding from the forecastle, now cooling and turning a dull, matte brown. They look innocent enough now, but you know what's inside them. You know the pressure that's waiting to be unleashed. The physics of this weapon are a testament to how far humans will go to protect their home, turning a peaceful galley into a pressurized engine of devastation that defies the very nature of the sea. If the heat doesn't break your spirit, the sound certainly will. You're standing on the upper deck now, and the air is suddenly punctured by a sound so violent and alien that it feels like it's vibrating your very teeth. This is the sound of the siphon, and it's perhaps the most underestimated component of the Byzantine arsenal. When that valve finally opens and the pressurized liquid hits the atmosphere, it doesn't just catch fire, it roars. Historians and chroniclers from the era, including those from the Arab and later the Crusader sides, consistently describe a booming or thundering noise that preceded the flames. The mainstream historical fact is that the combination of the high-pressure pump and the rapid expansion of the volatile naphtha created a primitive jet engine effect. It was a sonic boom in a world that, at most, was used to the rhythmic clatter of oars and the shouting of men. Imagine you are an enemy sailor. You've heard the stories, but you've never seen the sea fire in person. You're bracing for the impact of a ram or the whistle of arrows. Instead, you hear a sound like a giant bellows being shredded, a deep guttural wumpus that echoes off the surface of the water and drowns out the beat of your own drums. It's a psychological reset button. The sound alone is enough to make a man drop his shield. It's the sound of a dragon's breath, and in the 7th century, people still very much believed in dragons. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines intentionally modified the bronze nozzles to amplify this sound, essentially creating a trumpet for the fire to maximize the terror. Given their penchant for psychological warfare, it's almost a certainty. You watch the siphonator adjust his stance as the sound peaks. The nozzle is vibrating with the sheer force of the liquid rushing through it. It's a quirky tidbit that some Byzantine sources refer to the weapon not just as liquid fire, but as thundering fire. There's even a fringe theory that the booming was actually a series of small, rapid-fire detonations within the tube, a kind of primitive pulsajet. Whatever the mechanical cause, the effect is a paralyzing wall of noise. You probably wouldn't survive the mental breakdown that follows. When your brain can't categorize a sound, it defaults to pure lizard brain panic. You see the enemy rowers lose their timing, their oars tangling in the water as they look over their shoulders to see where the thunder is coming from. There's a specific frequency to the siphono low-end rumble that you can feel in your chest. It's the same feeling you get standing near a modern rocket launch or a heavy industrial furnace. For a medieval soldier whose loudest daily experience might be a blacksmith's hammer or a church bell, this was an apocalyptic event. The sound traveled across the water with terrifying clarity, signaling to every ship in the vicinity that the dromons had begun their work. It was a dinner bell for the crows. You notice the Byzantine crew wearing earplugs made of wax and wool, a small but vital detail that highlights the industrial nature of this warfare. They knew the sound was a weapon, and they protected themselves from it while unleashing it on everyone else. Historians still argue whether the roar was a sign of efficiency or a mechanical flaw that the Byzantines simply leaned into. If the liquid was atomizing perfectly, it should have been a steady hiss. The booming suggests a slightly unstable combustion, a flickering of the flame that created pressure waves in the air. But in the theater of war, unstable is often better. It makes the weapon feel unpredictable, alive, and angry. You see a young Byzantine sailor flinch every time the siphon coughs. A reminder that even for the winners, this machine is a terrifying neighbor. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? It might have helped with the heat, but it did nothing for the psychological trauma of hearing the sea scream. The sound also served a tactical purpose. It was a signal. In the chaos of a naval battle, with smoke obscuring everything, the roar told the Byzantine admirals exactly where the front line was. They could coordinate their maneuvers by ear. You see your captain nodding as a distant boom echoes from the far side of the fleet. He knows his brother-in-arms has engaged the enemy's left flank. It's a rudimentary but effective form of acoustic battlefield awareness. Meanwhile, for the enemy, the sound is a shroud. It masks the orders of their officers and the screams of the wounded, replacing the structure of command with a monotonal roar of destruction. There is a fringe legend that the Byzantines actually mixed certain salts into the fuel specifically to make the flame crackle and pop like a million breaking bones. While that sounds a bit like medieval propaganda, the chemical reality of burning resins and sulfur would certainly produce a chaotic, snapping soundscape. You watch as a jet of fire hits the mast of an enemy ship, and the sound changes to a high-pitched whistle as the wind catches the flaming liquid. It's a haunting, musical nightmare. It turns the battle into a dark opera where the only singer is the fire. As the siphonator closes the valve, the silence that follows is almost as heavy as the noise. Your ears are ringing, and the world feels muffled, as if you've been submerged in oil yourself. You see the enemy ship, now a silent, glowing husk, drifting away. The sound has stopped, but the memory of it is etched into the minds of everyone who heard it. This is why the siphons were so hard to overcome. You could prepare your body with leather and vinegar, but you couldn't prepare your mind for the sound of the world ending. The Byzantines hadn't just mastered chemistry and physics. They had mastered the art of the sonic shadow, a place where courage goes to die. You lean against the rail, waiting for your hearing to return. The sound of the siphon is the heartbeat of the Byzantine defense, a terrifying reminder that as long as the copper pipes are roaring, the city is safe. But you can't help but wonder what happens when the sound finally stops for good. For now, though, the air is beginning to hum again as the pumpers' Balautic start their rhythm. The pressure is building. The lion is getting ready to roar again, and you find yourself reaching for your own wax plugs, bracing for the next symphony of the inferno. Historians still argue about the exact decibel levels these machines could produce. But standing here, the numbers don't matter. What matters is the way the sound strips away your humanity and leaves only the instinct to run. It's a masterclass in psychological dominance. You see the enemy fleet beginning to scatter, not because their ships are all on fire, but because they can't stand to hear the sound again. They are retreating from a noise. As your ship moves forward, the ghost ship of the morning is now the thundering beast of the afternoon, and the sea belongs to the roar. The roar subsides for a moment, but the visual horror that remains is perhaps even more unsettling. You look over the railing, and you see the true napalm of the Middle Ages in its most defiant state. On the surface of the water, the fire isn't going out, it's thriving. This is the moment where the enemy's logic completely shatters. In any other naval engagement in history, the ocean is the ultimate safety net. If your clothes catch fire, you jump. If the deck gets too hot, you douse it with a bucket. But as you watch a frantic Arab sailor leap from his burning vessel into the waves, you witness a scene that defies the natural order. Instead of the fire being extinguished, the flames simply transfer to the water's surface, surrounding him in a bobbing orange halo. The mainstream historical fact here is that Greek fire was hydrophobic and less dense than seawater, allowing it to float and continue burning with terrifying efficiency. This wasn't just a fire, it was a liquid that used the sea as its platform. Historians still argue whether the mixture contained quicklime calcium oxide, which reacts violently with water to produce heat, potentially reigniting the naphtha, or at least keeping the reaction aggressive. As you watch the floating patches of flame drift toward other ships, you realize the water has become a conductor of death rather than a savior. You probably would unsurvive the sheer cognitive dissonance of seeing the ocean the thing that is supposed to be, wet acting like dry tinder. There's a quirky tidbit about the appearance of the flame itself. Because of the resins and crude oil, it wasn't a clean blue-white fire. It was a thick, heavy flame that produced a greasy, soot-filled smoke. It looked like the water was bleeding fire. You see the enemy's hull blackened and bubbling where the liquid has touched it. Unlike a normal fire that might char the surface, this sea fire seems to eat into the wood, fueled by its own internal chemistry. You see a patch of the substance stuck to an oar, and as the oar dips into the water, the flame actually grows more intense for a second, snapping and popping as it hits the brine. It's a chemical middle finger to the very concept of a water-based defense. Imagine the desperation of the enemy commanders. They've spent their lives learning how to manage normal disasters, but this is an ontological shock. Historians still argue whether the water-radiating property was a deliberate design or a fortunate byproduct of using raw bitumen. Regardless, the tactical reality is that the Byzantines have turned the entire battlefield into a trap. You see a Byzantine sailor casually toss a bucket of water onto a small spill on your own deck, but he does it with a specific additive, likely vinegar or old urine, which are the only things that seem to break the surface tension of the oil. Without those neutralizers, the ship is a ticking time bomb. There is a fringe theory that the Byzantines actually practiced press-licking the water. The idea was that they would pump out a thin layer of the oil before igniting it, creating a minefield of flammable liquid that they would then light with a single dirt pot. Watching the way the current carries the burning patches toward the enemy's retreat path, you can see how effective that would be. It turns the sea into a labyrinth where every turn leads to a wall of heat. You remember that crocodile dung joke? Well, some enemy sailors were so desperate, they reportedly tried covering their ships in a mixture of mud and animal dung to try and create a non-flammable crust. It didn't work. The liquid fire just soaked into the mud and turned it into a glowing hot clay. The psychological weight of fire on water is what truly turned naval battles into horror shows. It suggests a divine or demonic intervention. To the medieval mind, if the water won't put out the fire, then the world is ending. You see the enemy's formation dissolve into a chaotic scramble. Ships collide with each other in their hurry to escape the floating. It's a domino effect of terror. One burning ship drifts into another, and because the fire is a liquid, it flows across the gap, jumping from hull to hull. The sea, which usually separates and protects ships, is now the very thing binding them together in a shared funeral pyre. You notice the firemasters on your ship watching the floating flames with a cold, professional detachment. They aren't amazed, they're calculating. They're watching the way the wind and the tide move the slick. They understand the fluid dynamics of their nightmare. Historians still argue how long these floating patches could stay lit. Some accounts suggest they could burn for over an hour, turning the harbor of Constantinople into a literal lake of fire that lasted long after the actual fighting had ceased. You can see the oily residue shimmering on the waves, even where the fire has died, down a toxic, iridescent warning to anyone thinking of returning. As your ship maneuvers through a gap in the burning debris, you see the sticky nature of the fire again. A piece of burning hemp rope falls from a mast and lands on a floating plank. The fire immediately fuses the two together. It's a napalm in every sense of the word, a substance designed to cling and consume. You realize that the Byzantines hadn't just invented a weapon. They had invented a new state of matter for the battlefield. They had made fire behave like water, and water behave like oil. The heat coming off the surface of the sea is so intense, it creates its own microclimate. You feel a hot, dry wind rushing upward, drawing in the cooler air from the surrounding harbor. This firestorm effect makes it even harder for the enemy to man their oars. They are being suffocated by the very oxygen that is feeding the flames on the water. You probably wouldn't survive the lung damage from the toxic sulfurous mist that rises when the liquid fire meets the salt spray. It's a total environmental takeover. Looking back at the path your dromon has carved through the enemy fleet, you see a trail of orange light that stretches for miles. The napalm of the Middle Ages has done its job. It has broken the one rule that every sailor lives by, that the water is your friend. As the sun sinks lower, the sea fire provides its own hellish illumination, casting long, dancing shadows of the sinking ships against the walls of the city. You stand there, a witness to the subversion of nature, knowing that after tonight, no one will ever look at the Mediterranean the same way again. As you stand on the deck of the dromon, the sensory assault reaches a new, grisly peak. The horror show is no longer just about the technology, it's about the human cost. This is the part of the battle where the screams in the rigging begin to haunt you. You watch as the liquid fire hits the masts and the tangled webs of hemp and linen above the enemy decks. In a matter of seconds, the ship's propulsion system is transformed into a towering inferno. The rigging, soaked in years of tar and sea salt, acts like a series of fuses, carrying the fire upward into the sails. The mainstream historical fact is that Byzantine naval tactics specifically targeted the upper works of enemy ships to immobilize them and create a rain of fire that would fall onto the crews below. You see enemy sailors climbing the shrouds, desperately trying to cut away burning canvas, only to find themselves trapped 50 feet in the air with no escape but the burning water below. The air becomes a thick, suffocating soup of wood smoke and chemical fumes. This is where the tactical chaos truly sets in. On a wooden ship, there is nowhere to hide. If you go below deck to escape the heat, you risk being trapped in a smoke log where the oxygen is rapidly replaced by carbon monoxide. If you stay on deck, you are showered by globs of sticky burning naphtha that fall like hellish rain from the melting rigging. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines used specialized pyros in tandem with the siphons to ensure the sails were the first things to ignite. But watching the speed of the spread, it's clear the siphon alone is more than enough. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Byzantines actually had a psychological profile for their enemies, noting that the northerners, like the Rus, were more likely to jump overboard in panic, while the easterners, the Arabs, were more likely to stay and fight the fire until the very end. This cultural observation allowed the Byzantine captains to adjust their burn rate accordingly. You probably wouldn't survive the atmosphere on that enemy deck. The heat is high enough to boil the resin out of the wood, creating a secondary sweating of flammable gas that can cause the entire hull to flash over in an instant. It's not just a fire, it's a chemical explosion in slow motion. You see a Byzantine soldier using a long-handled hook to pull back a piece of burning debris that has drifted too close to your ship. There is an eerie, practiced calm on your deck that contrasts sharply with the frantic, animalistic movements on the enemy vessels. Historians still argue whether the sea fire was more effective as a physical weapon or a psychological one. But as you watch an enemy officer fall to his knees, his hands over his face as his ship dissolves around him, the answer seems to be both. The tactical chaos is so absolute that command and control cease to exist. There are no more signals, no more maneuvers, just individuals trying to find one more breath of unburned air. There is a fringe theory that the Byzantines actually added smoke-producing agents like damp straw or specific mineral powders to the mixture to create a total whiteout or blackout on the enemy deck. This would prevent the enemy from even seeing where the next jet of fire was coming from. You notice the thick, oily soot coating your own hands, and you realize that for the enemy, the world has literally gone dark, punctuated only by the blinding orange of the flames. It's a sensory deprivation chamber filled with heat. Remember that crocodile dung joke? The irony is that the stench of the Greek fire is so overpowering that you almost welcome the smell of a swamp just to have a different scent in your nostrils. The fire also creates a terrifying phenomenon known as a backdraft within the enemy hull. As the fire consumes the air on the upper deck, it sucks oxygen through the rowing ports, creating a localized wind that pulls the flames inward toward the rowers. You can see the flickering light reflecting off the water near the enemy's oars, and then a sudden gout of flame bursts out of the rowing hulls. The men below, chained or braced at their benches, have no warning. This is the horror show at its most intimate. The very structure that was meant to protect them and give them speed has become an incinerator. You watch the enemy ship's mast finally give way, snapping with a sound like a giant bone breaking. It crashes into the sea, sending up a massive plume of steam and sparks. The tactical consequence is immediate. The ship is now a dead weight, drifting aimlessly and becoming a hazard to its own fleet. The Byzantines have mastered the art of area denial, using nothing but heat. You see your dromon pull away, the captain already looking for the next target. They don't need to sink every ship, They just need to turn enough of them into burning obstacles to break the enemy's formation. Historians still argue how the Byzantines managed to avoid the fire rain themselves. The secret seems to be in the dromons design. The forward-sloping prow and the specific angle of the siphon ensured that the liquid was always projected away from the ship's own sails. It's a master class in geometry as much as chemistry. You see a fire tender carefully wiping down the bronze nozzle with a wet cloth, treating it with the same care a surgeon treats a scalpel. They know that a single drop of this liquid in the wrong place could turn their own sanctuary into a tomb. As the enemy ship begins to list, the fire reaches the lower hull, where the bilge water and old oil have collected. The resulting explosion is a dull, muffled thud that sends a shockwave through the water, vibrating the hull of your own ship. You feel it in your marrow. The screams in the rigging have finally fallen silent, replaced by the crackle of burning cedar and the hiss of the sea. The tactical chaos has done its job. The enemy fleet is no longer an army. It's a collection of terrified survivors. You lean back against a bulkhead, your lungs burning from the acrid air. You realize that you've just seen the peak of medieval shock and awe. The Byzantines didn't just win a naval battle, they performed a ritual of destruction that would be whispered about in every port from London to Baghdad. The liquid fire is more than a weapon, it's a statement of imperial survival. And as the smoke continues to rise into the darkening sky, you know that the rain of fire has washed away any hope the invaders had of taking the city today. The sun begins to set, but the city isn't just protected by walls and water. It's protected by a silence that is bought with blood. You leave the deck and descend into the heart of the capital, following a high-ranking official toward the Great Palace. This is where the true power of the Byzantine Empire lies, not in the number of its soldiers, but in the Magnara, the specialized palace workshops where the fire is birthed. You are entering a world of a secret guarded by death. This wasn't a military secret in the modern sense. It was a sacred imperial mystery. The mainstream historical fact is that the formula for Greek fire was considered a state secret of the highest order, protected by an imperial decree that threatened anyone who dared reveal it with the anathema, religious and social death. Sentence and a literal execution for treason. As you walk through the dimly lit corridors of the Magnara, you notice that the workers here don't look like soldiers. They are elderly men with stained robes and singed eyebrows, moving with a haunted precision. They operate in a state of compartmentalization that would make a modern intelligence agency proud. One group handles the distillation of the naphtha, another the mixing of the resins, and a third the construction of the copper siphons. No single person, save perhaps the emperor and the chief chemist, knows the entire process from start to finish. This ensured that even if a worker were captured by the enemy, they couldn't give away the golden bird. Historians still argue whether the secret was kept through a guild-like structure or if it was a hereditary tradition passed from father to son. Within a few elite families of Heliopolis refugees, there is a quirky tidbit about the spiritual weight placed on this secret. Legend has it that the recipe was actually carved into the altar of the Hagia Sophia, but only in a cryptic symbolic language that only the anointed could read. Whether that's true or just clever propaganda to keep the superstitious away, the effect was the same. The fire was seen as a gift from God, and to steal it was to rob the heavens. You probably wouldn't survive the interrogation if you were caught lingering too long near the mixing vats. The Silenturous, the palace guards are everywhere, and they don't ask questions before drawing their blades. You feel the weight of the empire's survival in the very air of this workshop. It smells of paranoia and bitumen. You watch a master chemist carefully measure a dark, viscous liquid into a lead-lined jar. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines used heavy or light naphtha, or if they had discovered a way to chemically crack the oil to make it more volatile. As you watch him work, you realize that the secret wasn't just a list of ingredients, it was a process. It was the exact temperature of the copper, the specific duration of the stir, and the atmospheric conditions of the lab. It was a craft that required a lifetime to master. There is a fringe theory that the secret was actually lost because of a management failure, that during the chaos of the Fourth Crusade, the last group of men who knew the specific ratios were killed before they could train their successors. The Magnara was more than a factory. It was a psychological laboratory. It was here that they designed the theatrics of the fire, the beast-headed nozzles, and the colored flames we talked about earlier. They knew that a secret is most powerful when it's wrapped in a layer of the supernatural. You see a set of blueprints for a new type of siphon, one that uses a doubly action piston. The engineering is staggering. You realize that the secret guarded by death was also a secret guarded by intelligence. The Byzantines were essentially running a 7th century R&D department. They were constantly iterating, trying to make the fire stickier, the roar louder, and the range longer. Imagine being one of these workers. You live in a beautiful city, you are wealthed, and your family is cared for by the state, but you can never leave. You are a living repository of the empire's most valuable asset. If you go to a tavern and have one too many cups of wine, you might accidentally sentence your entire city to a Viking or Arab conquest. The pressure must have been suffocating. You notice the way the workers communicate in whispers. Even when no one is around, they have internalized the silence. It's a culture of total absolute security. Remember that crocodile dung joke? In the Magnara, that's the kind of thing they might actually tell a captured spy just to lead them down a blind alley, while the real formula stays hidden in a lead box. Historians still argue about the role of the firemasters in the political hierarchy. Some believe they were actually high-ranking priests, blending the roles of scientist and theologian to ensure the weapon was always seen as a holy fire. This would explain why the secret was so resilient. It wasn't just a job, it was a religious duty. You see a small shrine in the corner of the workshop, dedicated to Saint Michael the Archangel, the general of the heavenly host. The fire was his sword, and these men were his armorers. This fusion of technology and faith is what made the secret so impenetrable to outsiders who saw the fire only as sorcery. As you prepare to leave the workshop, you see a shipment of raw materials being brought in under heavy guard. The crates are unmarked, and the guards are from the Varangian Guard foreigners, who do speak the local language and have no ties to the Sidious guilds. This is the ultimate Byzantine move, using people who can tea-talk to guard the people who won tea-talk. The logistics of the secret were just as carefully planned as the chemistry. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with the evening air. You've seen the source of the nightmare, and you realize that the fire in the pipes is nothing compared to the fire of the will that keeps it hidden. The Magnara would eventually fall into ruin, its secrets buried under centuries of conquest and neglect. But for now, it is the most important building in the world. It is the brain of the dromon, the heart of the siphon, and the reason the Queen of Cities still breathes. You walk out into the twilight, the smell of sulfur finally beginning to fade, replaced by the scent of incense from a nearby church. The secret is safe for another day, another year, another century. And as the iron gates of the palace district click shut behind you, you realize that some secrets aren't just guarded by death, they are fueled by it. The secret workshops of the Magnara provide the fuel, but a weapon is only as good as its delivery system. To understand why the sea fire was so effective, you have to look at the bones of the ship you're standing on. This isn't just a generic galley, it is the tactical evolution of the dromon. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Byzantines had refined this vessel into a specialized platform for chemical warfare. The mainstream historical fact is that the dromon, literally the runner, was a birema ship with 2 banks of oars, designed for speed, agility, and a shallow draft that allowed it to navigate the treacherous currents of the Bosporus. But as the use of Greek fire became standardized, the very architecture of the ship changed to accommodate the weight of the boilers and the recoil of the siphons. You walk along the central gangway, noticing how the ship feels front-to-view. The prow has been reinforced with massive beams of oak to support the castle, the elevated platform where the siphonator stands. This structure isn't just for height. It's a protective box designed to shield the delicate pump mechanisms from enemy boarding parties. Historians still argue whether the dromon's design was a direct evolution of the Roman Liburnian or if it was a radical departure necessitated by the unique stresses of pressurized fire. As you look at the way the wood is joined, you see copper plates covering the areas most likely to be splashed by backspray. The ship itself is becoming a hybrid of organic wood and industrial metal, a floating machine built for a single, terrifying purpose. Here, a quirky tidbit. The Byzantines were so obsessed with the weight distribution of the dromon that they actually used the liquid fire vats as adjustable ballast. By shifting the volume of naphtha between the port and starboard tanks, they could lean the ship into a turn or stabilize it in high winds. You probably wouldn't survive the physical strain of being a rower on a dromon. Because the fire equipment took up so much space and weight, the living quarters were practically non-existent. The rowers slept on their benches, surrounded by the smell of vinegar and oil. It was a miserable, cramped existence, but it produced a crew that was as much a part of the machine as the bronze pipes. You notice that the dromon lacks the massive bronze ram that defined the triremes of ancient Greece. Instead, it has a spur, a long pointed extension of the bow located above the waterline. This change in naval architecture was a direct result of the siphon. You don't want to ram an enemy ship and get stuck in its hull if you were about to set it on fire. The spur was designed to smash the enemy's oars and brush alongside them, allowing the siphonator to spray the length of the opponent's deck at point-blank range. It's a shift from the punch of ancient warfare to the sting of the medieval era. Historians still argue whether this shift made the Byzantine navy more or less effective in a fair fight. But as you watch the agile dromons spin on a dime, it's clear they weren't interested in fairness. There is a fringe theory that the dromons were equipped with felt-lined or ports to dampen the sound of the rowing, allowing them to approach enemy fleets in the dead of night like a pack of wolves. Imagine being on an Arab or Viking ship, the water calm, when suddenly the silhouette of a dromon appears out of the mist, its bronze lion already glowing with the pilot light. The tactical evolution of the ship was about creating a stealth delivery system for an unstealthy weapon. You remember that crocodile dung joke? While the Byzantines actually used a mixture of tallow and wax to slick the hull, reducing friction in the water to give them that extra knot of speed needed to close the gap before an enemy could fire their catapults. You see the keelmaster checking the tension of the internal bracing. A dromon under full pressure from the siphon and full speed from the rowers was under incredible structural stress. The recoil of the liquid being forced through the nozzle was enough to make the ship shudder. You realize that the ship wasn't just a transport, it was a calibrated instrument. Every beam, every oar, and every copper pipe had to work in perfect synchronization. If the ship was too slow, the fire wouldn't reach. If the ship was too light, the siphon would tip it. It was a delicate, deadly dance of naval engineering that the rest of the world simply couldn't replicate. Historians still argue about the exact size of these vessels. While the standard dromon carried about 200 men, there were Pamphilos variants, smaller, faster scouts, and Chaladia, which were larger and meant for transporting horses. But all of them, regardless of size, were being retrofitted to carry at least one siphon. The Tactica of Emperor Leo VI explicitly describes how to coordinate these different ship types to funnel the enemy into a fire pocket. You see a signalman on the middeck practicing with his flags. He's not just signaling for a charge, he is coordinating a crossfire where two dromons would catch a flagship in a pincer of liquid flame. As you look at the sleek, predatory lines of the hull, you realize that the dromon is the true ancestor of the modern destroyer. It was built for speed, it carried a high-tech missile in its prow, and it relied on a highly trained, technical crew. The Byzantines had moved beyond the era of floating infantry and into the era of specialized naval platforms. You feel the ship lean as the rowers pull a sharp turn, the water hissing against the slicked wood. The evolution is complete. The dromon is no longer just a ship. It is the delivery mechanism for the Empire's survival, a wooden shark with a heart of fire. The sun catches the bronze work on the forecastle, and for a moment, the ship looks like a piece of jewelry floating on the blue water. But you know better. You've seen the interior. You know the filth, the heat, and the precision required to keep this thing afloat. You realize that the Byzantine Empire survived not just because of a secret chemical recipe, but because they were the only ones willing to build such a complex, dangerous, and beautiful machine to carry it. The dromon was the stage, and the fire was the star. But without the stage, the show could never have happened. You walk back toward the stern, looking at the wake of the ship. It's clean and straight, a testament to the skill of the helmsman and the design of the hull. But the air still carries that faint, lingering scent of naphtha, reminder that this runner is always carrying a heavy burden. As the dromon accelerates, you feel the power of the Byzantine naval tradition beneath your feet. It's a tradition of adaptation, where every defeat in the past led to a new structural reinforcement or a better pump in the present. They weren't just building ships, they were building a legacy of technical defiance. The tactical brilliance of the dromon was put to its ultimate test during the siege of 717 AD, an event that makes the previous blockade look like a mere rehearsal. You are now standing on the walls of Constantinople during the harshest winter anyone can remember. The Bosporus has actually begun to freeze at the edges, and the Arab fleet, led by the Caliphate's finest generals, has surrounded the city with over 2,000 ships. The mainstream historical fact is that this second siege was the Stalingrad of the Middle Ages. If the city fell, there was nothing left to stop the Umayyad expansion into Europe. But as you look out over the frozen ramparts, you see the Byzantine fleets, mauled, battered, but still carrying the liquid fire. The cold was so biting that the Byzantines had to find a way to keep the naphtha from thickening into a useless sludge. You see technicians on the dromons carrying glowing braziers close to the storage tanks, a terrifyingly dangerous necessity. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines used a winter blend of the fire perhaps, adding more light oils or alcohol to keep the mixture fluid, or if they simply relied on the constant heat of the internal furnaces. Standing there, you watch as the Byzantine Emperor, Leo the Isaurian, orders the fleet out into the ice-clogged waters. The enemy is overconfident. They believe the Roman fire magic is dampened by the freezing sleet. They are about to be corrected in the most violent way possible. There is a quirky tidbit from the chronicles of the time. The Arab sailors were so desperate for warmth that they huddled together in their ships, creating massive, densely packed clusters of wooden hulls. To the Byzantine dromons, this wasn't just a target. It was an invitation. As the first dromon breaks through a thin shelf of ice and unleashes its siphon, the contrast is staggering. In a world of white and gray, a lance of neon-orange flame cuts through the air. The fire doesn't just burn the ships, it melts the very ice around them, creating a chaotic, churning slurry of boiling water and freezing waves. You probably would unsurvive the thermal shock of this environment. One side of your body would be blistering from the Greek fire, while the other was literally developing frostbite from the winter gale. You see the Arab fleet begin to panic as the fire spreads across the ice. Because the naphtha floats, it creates a burning sea even on top of the frozen slush. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines used the siphon to actually clear paths through the ice for their own maneuvers, effectively using the weapon as an 8th century icebreaker. It's a brilliant, if terrifying, adaptation. You watch as a massive Arab galley is engulfed. The sailors try to jump onto the ice to escape, but the liquid fire follows them, turning the frozen surface into a slippery, burning trap. It's a horror show that defies the seasons. There is a fringe theory that the Byzantines actually used fire sleds during this siege. Small, flat-bottomed boats filled with the liquid and pushed across the ice toward the anchored enemy fleet. Imagine the sight of a ghost-white landscape suddenly punctuated by sliding lanterns of death. The psychological impact was total. The invaders, who were already suffering from famine and a devastating outbreak of plague, began to see the Greek fire as a divine curse. You remember that crocodile dung joke? Well, by this point, the Arab soldiers were reportedly eating their own horses and even the hides of their shields. They didn't have the energy or the materials to defend against a chemical inferno. You watch the Byzantine ships return to the Golden Horn, their hulls covered in a mixture of soot and rime ice. They look like demons rising from the underworld. The siege of 717 was won not just by the fire, but by the fact that the fire worked when everything else failed. It was the only source of offensive heat in a world that was freezing to death. The mainstream historical consensus is that this victory saved Western civilization. Yet the men on the ships were too cold and exhausted to celebrate. They just focused on the rhythmic clack hiss of the pumps, making sure the last of the pressure was bled off before the valves froze shut. Historians still argue about the role of the Greek fire in the final destruction of the Arab fleet as they finally retreated. As the remnants of the once massive armada sailed away, they were hit by a series of volcanic storms near the island of Thera. Some say that sea fire had already so weakened the structural integrity of their hulls, charring the wood and melting the pitch, that the ships simply fell apart in the waves. Whether the fire or the volcano finished them, the result was the same. Out of 2,500 ships, barely 5 made it back to the Levant. It was a 99% casualty rate. As you stand on the wall, watching the last of the enemy sails disappear into the winter mist, you feel a strange sense of relief. The liquid fire has held the line, but you also see the cost. The city is a skeleton of its former self, and the men who handle the fire look like they've seen too much of the other side. You realize that Greek fire was a weapon of absolute necessity. It wasn't something you used for glory, it was something you used when the alternative was extinction. The ice on the Bosporus begins to crack as the tide turns, a sound like 1,000 siphons priming at once. The 717 siege proved that the weapon was weatherproof. a realization that made the Byzantines even more confident in their technical superiority. They had turned the coldest winter in history into a bonfire of their enemies. You lean against a stone merlon, your breath hitching in the cold air, and you realize that the horror show of the sea fire was the only thing that kept the city's heart beating. It was a light in the dark, but it was a light that burned everything it touched. As the first hints of a pale spring sun touch the Hagia Sophia, the fire tenders finally sleep. The siphons are cleaned with vinegar and greased with tallow, ready for a spring that will never see the Arab fleet return in such numbers again. The sea fire has become the stuff of legend, a story that will be told from the deserts of Arabia to the halls of the Vikings. And you, standing in the silence of the aftermath, know that the ice may melt, but the memory of the fire on the frozen water will never fade. While the massive ship-mounted siphons are the stars of the Byzantine navy, the terror of the liquid fire wasn't confined to the open sea. As you descend from the city walls and move toward the armory of the palace guards, you encounter a much more intimate version of the nightmare, the cherasufin, or the handheld siphon. This is the horror of the hand siphon, a portable flamethrower that turned a single soldier into a walking engine of destruction. The mainstream historical fact is that by the 10th century, the Byzantines had scaled down their hydraulic technology to create a handheld brass tube that a soldier could carry into the thick of a siege. It was the world's first true man-portable flamethrower. And seeing it up close, it looks like a piece of occult machinery. You pick up one of these devices, and the weight is the first thing that surprises you. It's a heavy, double-walled brass cylinder with a manual pump handle at the rear. It isn't a weapon for a weakling. To use it, you have to stand on the battlements, or even better, on the ramp of a siege tower, and work the pump with a steady, rhythmic motion to build pressure before opening the front valve. Historians still argue whether the cherasifine used the same heavy naphtha as the ships or a lighter, more volatile scalp blend that would ignite more easily without a constant furnace. As you grip the leather-wrapped handles, you realize that this weapon was designed for the most brutal facetto-face combat imaginable. You probably would unsurvive a trench or a breach if the guy across from you was holding one of these. There is a quirky tidbit in the military manuals of the time, specifically the Siloge Tacticorum, which suggests that the handsiphon was most effective when used from above. The Byzantines would wait until the enemy had scaled their ladders and were just inches from the top of the wall. Instead of meeting them with spears, a soldier would lean over the merlon and unleash a three-scond burst of liquid flame directly into the cluster of men below. It wasn't just about killing, it was about clearing the ladder. One burst could turn a dozen men into screaming torches, who would then fall backward into their comrades, spreading the fire and the panic. It's a level of brutality that makes a sword fight look civilized. Imagine the perspective of a soldier at the bottom of a siege ladder. You're looking up, your shield over your head to block arrows, when you hear that familiar, terrifying hiss-roar. Suddenly, a stream of golden liquid splashes over your shield. It doesn't bounce off, it wraps around the edges. It drips onto your hands and seeps through the eye slits of your helmet. This is the psychological breaking point. Historians still argue whether the hand siphon was truly effective in terms of kill counts, or if its primary value was simply making it impossible for the enemy to maintain their footing. In the chaos of a breach, a single man with a cherasiphon could hold a gap against 100 attackers simply because no one wanted to be the first person to step into the fire. There is a fringe theory that the Byzantines actually used fire pumps to spray the liquid onto their own walls, which had been treated with a special fire-resistant lime wash to create a burning wall that the enemy literally could untouch. Watching a demonstration in the courtyard, you see the soldier pulse the flame. He doesn't hold it down. He shoots short, controlled bursts. This saved fuel and prevented the brass tube from overheating and exploding in his hands. You remember that crocodile dung joke? Well, the men who operated the handsiphines were known to wear heavy, multi-layered, silk and leather soaked in vinegar to protect themselves from the intense backdraft that occurred when the fire hit a nearby surface. You notice the intricate engraving on the nozzle, often a smaller version of the lioness head seen on the ships. It's a reminder that even in the mud and blood of a land siege, the Byzantines maintained their sense of imperial style. But the weapon itself is anything but stylish. It is a messy, terrifying tool. You see a fire squad practicing a maneuver where they overlap their streams to create a wall of fire. It's a tactical evolution of the phalanx, replaced by a phalanx. Historians still argue how common these weapons were, as the difficulty of manufacturing the precision pumps meant. They were likely reserved for elite units or the most critical sections of the wall. The hand siphon also played a role in countermining. If the enemy tried to tunnel under the walls of Constantinople, the Byzantines would dig their own tunnels to meet them. Once the two tunnels broke through, the Byzantines wouldn't send in swordsmen. They would stick the nozzle of a siphon into the dark hole and pull the trigger. The fire would consume all the oxygen in the tunnel in seconds, suffocating anyone it didn't burn. It turned the earth itself into an oven. You probably would unsurvive the nightmare of being trapped in a lightless tunnel when the liquid fire comes screaming around the corner. As you set the brass tube back on its rack, you feel a lingering warmth on your palms. The siphon represents the ultimate democratization of the horror show. It took the power of the great dromon and put it into the hands of a single, determined defender. It ensured that even if an enemy made it past the burning sea, they still had to face the burning wall. You realize that the Byzantine Empire wasn't just protected by technology, it was protected by a willingness to bring the most horrific elements of the laboratory onto the front lines of the human experience. The sun reflects off the polished brass of the armory's stock, and for a second, it looks like the tubes are already glowing. You walk away, the smell of the sulfur and old leather sticking to your clothes. The horror of the hand siphon is a reminder that the Byzantines didn't just want to defeat their enemies. They wanted to make the very act of attacking them seem like a journey into hell. And as you look up at the massive walls of the city, you see the firemasters taking their positions, the brass nozzles of their hand siphons glinting in the twilight like the eyes of a predator waiting for the first sign of movement. While the mechanics of the siphons are grounded in physics, the way the empire sold the weapon to the world was pure theater. You are now walking through the shadows of the Hagia Sophia, where the flickering candlelight catches the gold leaf of the mosaics. Here, the horror show takes on a spiritual dimension. To the Byzantines, Greek fire wasn't just a chemical compound. It was a divine gift, a holy fire bestowed upon the first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great, by an angel. The mainstream historical fact is that the Byzantine state used the church to shroud the weapon in a layer of religious invincibility, creating a narrative that the fire would only work for a legitimate Roman emperor. It was the ultimate divine right backed by napalm. Historians still argue whether the emperors actually believed this legend or if it was a calculated piece of psychological warfare designed to keep the secret from being sold. Imagine being a foreign ambassador invited to a palace reception. You aren't shown the dirty workshops or the sweaty men at the pumps. Instead, you are told stories of how the fire would spontaneously ignite the hands of any barbarian who tried to touch it. This created a psychological barrier that was almost as effective as the physical one. You probably wouldn't survive the mental gymnastics required to be a spy in this city. You'd be constantly second-guessing whether you were dealing with science or a literal curse from God. There is a quirky tidbit about the fire anathema. The Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus wrote in his manual, De Administrando Imperio, that the fire was one of three things that must never leave the city, the other two being the imperial, vestments, and the princesses. He claimed that an angel had appeared to Constantine the Great and forbidden the secret disclosure under pain of eternal damnation. This wasn't just a law, it was a spiritual offense. Historians still argue whether this was a response to a real attempt to steal the recipe or a proactive way to ensure no Byzantine official would ever dream of selling the liquid gold to the Bulgars or the Franks. You see a group of pilgrims crossing themselves as they pass a dromon anchored in the harbor. To them, that bronze lion's head is a holy relic, a physical manifestation of God's protection over the new Rome. This religious framing turned every sailor into a crusader and every siphonator into a priest of the flame. It gave the crew a morale boost that no amount of pay could match. When they pulled that lever, they weren't just killing. They were performing an act of divine justice. The psychological warfare worked both ways, made the Byzantines fearless and their enemies feel like they were fighting against the heavens themselves. There is a fringe theory that the Byzantines actually used sacred oils or incense in the mixture, specifically so that the smoke would smell like a church service. Imagine the sensory confusion of an enemy fleet, the roar of a dragon, the heat of a volcano, and the smell of a cathedral. It's a total subversion of the senses. You remember that crocodile dung joke? Well, the Byzantines would likely find such a primitive defense hilarious, as they believed their fire was fueled by the Holy Spirit rather than mere chemistry. It was a level of arrogance that was backed up by centuries of burned enemy hulls. You notice the way the secret guarded by death, as we saw in the Magnara, is reinforced here by the threat of excommunication. If the secret police didn't catch you, the devil would. This dual-layered security system is why the weapon remained a monopoly for so long. Even when the secret was partially lost or mimicked by later caliphates, they could never replicate the Byzantine ortho belief that the fire was a sentient, holy thing that chose its victims. Historians still argue whether the miraculous nature of the fire was actually a way to cover up occasional mechanical failures. If a siphon didn't work, it wasn't a broken valve, it was because the crew wasn't spiritually prepared. The psychological warfare was so successful that the mere presence of a dromon was often enough to end a conflict. You see an envoy from a northern tribe kneeling before the emperor, his eyes wide with fear after seeing a controlled demonstration in the harbor. The Byzantines were masters of the demonstration. They would take an old, captured hulk, tow it into the middle of the Bosporus, and incinerate it in front of foreign dignitaries. It was the 10th century version of a nuclear test. They wanted the world to know that they possessed the power of the sun and that they were the only ones authorized by God to use it. As you walk out of the great palace into the bustling streets, you realize that the divine favor was the glue that held the technical secrets together. Without the faith, the chemistry was just oil. But with the faith, it was a weapon that could not be overcome. You see the firemasters walking through the crowd, and people part for them like they are walking through a sea of water. They aren't just technicians, they are the keepers of the empire's soul. And as the sun sets behind the domes of the city, you realize that the psychological horror show was designed to make sure no one ever dared to dim that light. While the Arab fleets were the traditional rivals of the empire, a new and terrifying challenger emerged from the north in the 10th century. The Rus. Imagine you are standing on the northern sea walls of Constantinople in 941 AD. The horizon is jagged with the silhouettes of thousands of Viking-style longships. These aren't the heavy, lumbering galleys of the south. These are sleek, lightning-fast monoxyla, hollowed-out tree trunks manned by the fiercest warriors the world has ever seen. The Rus are used to winning. They have raided from the Caspian to the Baltic, and they believe their speed and ferocity will allow them to overrun the Roman softness. But as the first Byzantine dromons pull out of the harbor, you are about to witness the Rus and the Reign of Fire, a collision of two very different types of warrior cultures. The mainstream historical fact is that the Rus fleet, led by Prince Igor, was massive. Some chronicles claim 10,000 ships, though modern historians lean closer to a still terrifying 1,000. They had bypassed the main imperial army and thought the city was defenseless. But the Byzantines had a reserve of old Hafratan dromons that they quickly retrofitted with siphons. You see the Rus warriors standing on their prow decks, banging their shields and screaming war cries, confident that they can board these slow-moving Roman vessels. They don't realize that they are sailing into a specialized kill zone. The Viking longship, for all its beauty and speed, is a nightmare to be on when Greek fire is involved. It is open-decked, shallow, and made of highly resinous pine and oak. It's a floating torch waiting for a light. As the dromons engage, the sound of the siphons at Dragon's Roar we discussed dares through the northern battle songs. The Rus are legendary for their courage, but courage doesn't mean much when the very air turns into a furnace. You watch as a jet of fire hits the lead longship. Because the Viking boats have no castles or high sides, the liquid fire sweeps across the entire deck in a single pass. There is nowhere to hide. You probably wouldn't survive the panic that ensues. Unlike the disciplined Byzantine crews, the Rus warriors have never seen anything like this. To them, it isn't a weapon, it's a violation of the laws of the world. They believe the Romans have harnessed the sun itself. There is a quirky tidbit from the primary chronicle, the great historical record of the Rustai, which notes that the survivors who made it back to Kiev described the Romans as having the lightning from heaven in their power. They told stories of how the fire was thrown at them and how it caught them like birds in a net. This is the ultimate psychological victory. The Byzantines didn't just defeat an army, they created a folklore of terror that would protect the city's northern flank for generations. Historians still argue whether the Rustai would have eventually won through sheer numbers if they had been so psychologically broken by the first few minutes of the engagement. You watch as the Rus warriors, some of the most hardened men on the planet, begin to throw themselves into the Black Sea. But remember that napalm quality. The fire is floating on the swells. Even in the cold northern water, the flames continue to dance. There is a fringe theory that the Byzantines used a wide-angle nozzle for this specific battle, creating a spray rather than a lance to maximize the coverage against the smaller, more numerous Viking boats. It was a tactical adaptation, the shotgun versus the sniper rifle. You see the surface of the sea covered in burning longships, their dragon-headed prows melting into the waves. The horror of this specific battle was the speed of the destruction. Because the Rus ships were so small and light, the heat from the Greek fire was enough to cause the wood to warp and crack almost instantly. The monoxella would simply split apart, dumping the armored warriors into a sea that was literally on fire. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines followed up the fire with firepots grenades to ensure that any ship that escaped the siphon was still tagged with a lingering flame. Looking at the carnage, it's clear that the rain of fire was absolute. Out of the massive fleet that arrived in the morning, only a fraction escaped by the afternoon. There is a certain irony in this encounter. The Rus would eventually become the emperor's most loyal bodyguards, the Varangian Guard, but that relationship was forged in the fire of 941. They learned that the Greeks were unjust, wealthy, and decadent. They were dangerous masters of a secret world. You see a Byzantine officer calmly directing his siphonator to target a group of Rus who have tried to beach their ships to escape. The fire follows them onto the sand. It is a relentless, pursuit-oriented weapon. You probably wouldn't survive the run across that beach. The liquid fire stays active in the sand, turning the shore into a literal minefield of burning bitumen. As the smoke clears, you see the Byzantine dromons picking their way through the charred remains of the longships. They are looking for high-value prisoners, but there are few to be found. Most have been consumed by the Roman lightning. The mainstream historical consensus is that this battle essentially ended the era of Viking-style raids on Constantinople. It taught the North that the Queen of Cities had a dragon at her gate. You realize that the horror show was a necessary part of Byzantine diplomacy. It was the only way to communicate strength to a culture that only respected force. You notice a young Rus warrior being pulled from the water, his face a mask of disbelief and burns. He is staring at the siphon on the dromon's prow like it's a living god. He will go home and tell his children that the Romans can set the ocean on fire. This is how the legend of Greek fire grew, not through dusty books, but through the terrified whispers of the few who survived the rain of fire, and as the dromon turns back toward the Golden Horn. The crew begins the grueling process of cleaning the pipes, their movements as robotic and precise as ever. The fire is gone, but the lesson has been burned into history. As the charred remnants of the Rus longships drift toward the horizon, you realize that the world didn't just sit back and watch the Byzantines burn their way to victory. The horror show was so effective that it sparked a desperate arms race across the Mediterranean and the East. This brings us to the chemistry of the countermeasures. Imagine being an engineer in the shipyards of Cairo or a master shipbuilder in the ports of Venice. Your task is impossible. How do you stop a fire that loves water? You are essentially trying to invent fireproofing in an age of wood and wool. The mainstream historical fact is that enemy fleets began to experiment with radical ship designs, coating their vessels in substances they hoped would act as a chemical shield against the naphtha. You see a captured Arab vessel brought into the Byzantine docks for study. Its entire hull and rigging are draped in heavy raw oxides. These weren't just decorative, they were soaked in vinegar and thick layers of clay or sand. The idea was to create a damp, non-porous barrier that would prevent the sticky Greek fire from soaking into the wooden planks. Historians still argue whether these countermeasures actually worked, or if they just slowed the inevitable. As you run your hand over the stiff, sore-smelling leather, you realize the weight this added to a ship. A galley draped in wet hides is a slow, clumsy target. You probably wouldn't survive the tactical disadvantage of being so weighed down. By trying to survive the fire, you made yourself too slow to escape the ship carrying it. There is a quirky tidbit about the lengths to which sailors would go to protect themselves. Some records suggest that crews began to keep large jars of old urine on deck because of its ammonia content. It was believed to be one of the few liquids along with vinegar that could actually neutralize the chemical reaction of the Greek fire. Imagine the atmosphere on a warship during a summer campaign: the heat, the sweat, and the overwhelming stench of vinegar and urine-soaked hides. It was a sensory nightmare even before the battle began. Historians still argue whether the chemical properties of these substances truly broke down the naphtha, or if it was simply a psychological comfort for men facing certain death. You watch a Byzantine technician test a siphon against one of these shielded holes. The liquid fire hits the vinegar-soaked leather, and for a few seconds, it just slides off, dripping into the sea. But the heat is relentless. The vinegar evaporates, the leather shrinks and cracks, and the fire eventually finds a seam. Once it gets under the hide, the ship is doomed, as the leather now acts like an oven, trapping the heat against the wood. It's a bit of a fringe theory, but some scholars suggest the Byzantines countered these countermeasures by adding piercing agents or even metallic filings to the mix to shred the leather on impact. It was a constant game of move and countermove. There is a certain grim humor in the sandboxes you see on some enemy decks. Sailors would try to smother the liquid fire with buckets of dry sand. You see a demonstration where a man frantically throws sand onto a patch of burning oil. It works for a second, but because the Greek fire is a pressurized liquid, it just flows around the sand like lava. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? It's the same energy, a desperate, almost superstitious attempt to use the earth to stop something that feels unearthly. You realize that the Byzantines weren't just fighting men, they were fighting the very hope that a solution existed. You notice that the Byzantine dromons started using longer nozzle prows to reach over the protective hides of their enemies. The technical evolution never stopped. Historians still argue if the legendary talismans found on some Arab ship scrolls with protective prayers sealed in lead were considered a legitimate countermeasure. When science fails, you turn to the divine. But as you look at the scorched copper of the Byzantine siphons, you see a weapon that doesn't care about prayers. It only cares about pressure and oxygen. The most effective countermeasure was actually the simplest. Distance. Enemy fleets began to change their entire naval doctrine, moving away from the grapple and board style of the ancient world. They started using fire ships of their own vessels, packed with dry wood and oil, set adrift toward the Byzantines, hoping to force the dromons to use up their limited supply of Greek fire on empty targets. You see the Byzantine captains navigating this new landscape, using their superior speed to weave through the decoys. It turned naval warfare into a high-stakes game of chicken, where the first one to blink or run out of fuel lost everything. As you walk along the docks, you see the remnants of a ship that tried to use lead plating as a shield. The lead didn't burn, but it conducted the heat so efficiently that it basically toasted the crew inside the hull. It's a reminder that there is no perfect shield against a weapon that attacks the environment itself. You feel the grit of sand and the tang of vinegar in the air, a chemical ghost of a battle that happened weeks ago. The countermeasures were a testament to human ingenuity, but they were also a testament to human desperation. The horror show wasn't just the fire, it was the realization that no matter how much vinegar you poured or how many hides you hung, the Romans still held the match. You probably would unsurvive the crushing weight of that realization while standing on a deck that's slowly turning into a frying pan. You realize that the Byzantines had won the chemical war long ago, and everything their enemies did was just a way to delay the funeral. As the sun sets, casting long shadows over the shipyard, you see a master shipwright looking at a charred piece of oxide with a look of pure exhaustion. He knows that as long as the recipe for the liquid remains a secret, his work is just a bandage on a mortal wound. The chemistry of the countermeasures was a fascinating chapter in history, but in the end, the fire was just too grabby, too hot, and too persistent to be tamed by leather and sand. The dromons remain the kings of the sea, and the sea continues to burn. For all the technical mastery we've seen, we have to remember that the Byzantines weren't playing with a garden hose. They were riding a dragon made of copper and pressurized oil. As you descend once more into the guts of the dromon, the atmosphere is noticeably more frantic. This is the reality of a controlled explosion. You are standing in the pump room during a high-speed pursuit, and the smell of raw naphtha is so strong it makes your eyes water. One of the leather seals on the main force pump has begun to weep, a thin amber fluid, and the firemaster is screaming at his men to keep the pressure up despite the leak. This is the nightmare every Byzantine crew lived with. The weapon was just as dangerous to the user as it was to the target. The mainstream historical fact is that Greek fire was an inherently unstable substance that required extreme precision to manage. If the copper piping was improperly joined, or if the recoil of the liquid discharge caused a fracture in the delivery tube, the pressurized fire would spray inside the forecastle. This backfire or internal breach was often catastrophic. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines had any form of primitive fire suppression system, like specialized sandbins or vinegar-soaked blankets, kept at the ready, but most believe that once an internal leak ignited, the ship was effectively a lost cause. You probably wouldn't survive a breach in this cramped, oily hold. You'd be breathing fire before you could even reach the ladder. You watch the men at the bellows, their faces reflecting the flickering orange light from the furnace. They are working in a space filled with flammable vapors, a situation that modern safety protocols would find suicidal. A quirky tidbit from the naval manuals suggests that the siphonators were often chosen from among the most stoic or even fatalistic soldiers, as the job required standing inches away from a potential bomb while being shot at by enemy archers. There's a fringe theory that these men were paid triple the standard wage, a hazard pay that reflected the very real chance they would be vaporized by their own equipment. You see the firemaster checking the heat of the copper pipes with a wet finger. The hiss of the spit is his only gauge for whether the system is about to fail. The physics of the backfire were particularly terrifying. If the nozzle's pilot light was drawn into the tube by a sudden drop in pressure, perhaps because a rower missed a beat or a valve jammed a flame, could travel backward through the naphtha stream. Imagine the sheer horror of watching the fire retract into the bronze lion's mouth, followed by a muffled metallic thud from the boiler below. Historians still argue whether the siphon included a check valve or a flashback arrestor, a device that modern welders use to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. Looking at the complex, multi-stage valves on the Byzantine rig, it's clear they were at least trying to solve the problem, even if they didn't have a word for the physics behind it. You notice a small secondary pump near the main tank. This was used to purge the lines with vinegar or water after a burn. It's a delicate operation. If you don't purge the lines, the sticky resin will harden and clog the siphon for good. But if you purge it while the nozzle is still hot, you risk a steam explosion. You realize that the controlled explosion was a constant balancing act. Every engagement was a gamble where the prize was survival and the stake was a fiery death. Remember that crocodile dung joke? It's not so funny down here, where the air is thick with the smell of scorched metal and the very real possibility of a mechanical aneurysm. There is a fringe legend of a dromon during the 11th century that imploded during a victory parade. The story goes that the crew wanted to give the emperor a spectacular display, but they overpressurized the tanks. The resulting blast was so intense it reportedly shattered windows along the Golden Horn and sent the bronze lion's head flying into the palace gardens. Whether true or not, it highlights the psychological toll on the crew. They lived in a state of high-octane anxiety. You see a pumper wipe a bead of sweat from his forehead, only to realize his hand is coated in oil. He quickly wipes it off on a vinegar rag. In this room, a single spark from a boot nail hitting the deck could end the world. As the dromon lurches in a heavy swell, you feel the copper boiler shift slightly in its iron cradle. The firemaster immediately lunges to tighten a bolt. The machine is a living, breathing thing, and it's always trying to get out of its cage. Historians still argue how the Byzantines managed the sloshing of the liquid in the tanks, which could destabilize the ship or cause air pockets in the pump. Some think the tanks were baffled, much like a modern fuel tanker. This level of internal engineering is what separated the true Greek fireships from the crude imitations used by later powers. The horror show for the Byzantine crew was the silence after a malfunction. You see the siphonator pull the lever, but instead of the roar, there's only a wet, coughing sound and a dribble of fire that coats the ship's own spur. This was the moment of peak vulnerability. The enemy, seeing the Roman magic fail, would surge forward with renewed fury. You realize that the controlled explosion was as much about maintaining an image as it was about the fire itself. If the machine failed, the myth of divine protection vanished with it. You climb back to the deck, your lungs aching for fresh air. Behind you, the engine room continues its rhythmic, terrifying dance. To look at the sleek, painted exterior of the dromon and realize it's just a thin shell of cedar holding back a chemical disaster. The Byzantines were the ultimate high-wire artists of the medieval world, performing their act over a pit of burning naphtha. They didn't just master the fire, they mastered the fear of the fire. As the sun dips below the horizon, the glowing pipes of the siphon cool to a dull red. The controlled explosion has been successfully contained for one more day. But as the crew begins the long process of cleaning and inspecting every inch of the bronze, you see the exhaustion in their eyes. They aren't just warriors, they are survivors of their own technology. And as the ship glides into the dark, you realize that the greatest secret of Greek fire was the courage to keep it in a box and call it a weapon. The fire doesn't just appear out of thin air. It is the result of a vast, invisible network of trade and exploitation that stretched from the sun-scorched plains of the east to the cold waters of the Black Sea. To understand the logistics of the flame, you have to realize that the Byzantine Empire was essentially the world's first petrostate. As you walk along the docks of the Constantinople harbor, you see unmarked, heavy merchant vessels unloading thousands of sealed ceramic jars. These aren't filled with wine or olive oil. They contain rock oil, pungent bitumen, and naphtha collected from the seeps of the Absaron Peninsula or the eternal fires of Iraq. The mainstream historical fact is that the Byzantines maintained a sophisticated supply chain that secured these volatile raw materials, even when the lands they originated in were under enemy control. You watch a line of laborers carrying the jars under the watchful eyes of the Varangian Guard. This wasn't just a commercial transaction, it was a matter of national security. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines used front companies or intermediaries to buy oil from the very caliphates they were planning to burn, or if they relied entirely on their own northern sources, like the Crimean seeps. Imagine the logistical headache of transporting thousands of gallons of explosive liquid across the Mediterranean in wooden sailing ships. One spark, one heavy storm, and your entire supply chain becomes a floating bonfire. You probably wouldn't survive the stress of being a cargo master on these fuel tankers. You're essentially sitting on a giant bomb for weeks at a time. There is a quirky tidbit about the bitumen tax. Some Byzantine border provinces were reportedly allowed to pay their imperial dues in raw naphtha instead of gold coin. This highlights just how valuable the substance was to the central government. To the emperor, oil was money. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines had developed refined versions of these oils at the source to make them easier to transport, or if they did all the chemical processing within the city walls to prevent the secret from leaking to the provinces. You notice that the jars are double-sealed with wax and lead, a primitive but effective way to prevent the light ends of the naphtha from evaporating during the long journey. You follow a wagon load of these jars as they are moved into deep, cool limestone vaults beneath the city. This is the empire's strategic reserve. The logistics didn't stop at procurement. It was also about storage. The Byzantines knew that if a siege lasted years, like the ones in 674 or 717, they needed enough fuel to keep the siphons roaring every day. There is a fringe theory that the Great Palace was actually built over a network of secret cisterns specifically designed to hold hundreds of thousands of gallons of liquid fire safely away from the summer heat. It's a terrifying thought. The most beautiful city in the world was literally sitting on a lake of combustible fluid. The supply chain also included specialized materials like sulfur from volcanic islands and pine resin from the dense forests of the Pontic Mountains. Each ingredient had its own dedicated procurement officer. You see a shipment of sulfur being inspected. The firemasters look for a specific yellow hue that indicates purity. Remember that crocodile dung joke? While that was a myth, the actual ingredients were often kept under code names in the ledgers to confuse any spies. Naphtha might be listed as holy water, while sulfur was called groundstone. This layer of administrative smoke and mirrors ensured that even if a clerk went rogue, they wouldn't have the whole picture. Imagine the cost of this operation. The logistics of the flame was a massive drain on the imperial treasury, but it was considered a non-negotiable expense. You realize that the Byzantines weren't just better chemists than their neighbors, they were better bureaucrats. They could organize a multinational resource extraction project that would be impressive, even by modern standards. Historians still argue if the eventual loss of the firewells in the east following the rise of the Seljuk Turks was the real reason the weapon eventually faded from the battlefield. Without the raw material, the most advanced siphon in the world is just an expensive bronze pipe. You see a group of engineers measuring the density of a new batch of oil using a primitive hydrometer. This is quality control. If the oil is too thick, it won't spray. If it's too thin, it won't stick. The logistics was a marriage of transport and science. Every ship that arrived was a new data point for the palace chemists. You realize that the horror show was backed by a massive back office of accountants, sailors, and miners. It's a far cry from the image of a lone alchemist in a basement. This was industrial-scale warfare. As the wagons disappear into the high-security district of the Magnata, you feel a sense of the sheer scale of the Byzantine effort. They had turned their entire economy toward the maintenance of a single weapon. The Seafire wasn't just a military asset, it was a logistical miracle. You probably wouldn't survive the sheer boredom of the paperwork involved in this. But for the Empire, every tally mark on a naphtha jar was a day longer they could keep the walls standing. The sun sets over the harbor, and the merchant ships look like shadows on the water. You know that inside their holds, the blood of the earth is waiting to be turned into the breath of the dragon. The logistics of the flame is a reminder that in war, the person with the most fire is often the person with the best organized warehouse. The Byzantines understood this better than anyone. They didn't just play with fire. They managed it, tracked it, and taxed it. And as the iron gates of the warehouse district lock for the night, the secret stays safe, buried under a mountain of ledgers and lead-sealed jars. As you leave the warehouses behind and ascend toward the Hivo reception halls of the Chalk Gate, you realize that the liquid fire was on T, just a weapon for the Cit, was the Empire's most persuasive diplomat. In the Byzantine mind, the best battle was the one you never had to fight because your enemy was too terrified to show up. This brings us to fire as a diplomatic tool. Imagine you are a prince from a northern tribe or an envoy from a rising western kingdom. You've been brought to Constantinople, not to discuss trade, but to be honored with a seat at the emperor's right hand during a naval review. You aren't seeing a skirmish, you are watching a choreographed ritual of annihilation. The mainstream historical fact is that the Byzantines frequently used controlled demonstrations of Greek fire to intimidate foreign dignitaries. They would take a derelict ship, tow it into the center of the Bosporus, and have a dromon incinerate it in a matter of seconds. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who cross us. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines sometimes enhanced these diplomatic displays with extra chemicals to make the fire look even more supernatural. Perhaps adding copper salts to turn the flames a ghostly green. You probably would unsurvive the heart attack of seeing a ship vanish into a wall of neon-colored fire while a calm official offers you another cup of spiced wine. There is a quirky tidbit about the fire clause in Byzantine treaties. When negotiating with groups like the Bulgars or the Rus, the Byzantines would often include vague, terrifying language about the heavenly wrath that protected the city. It was a form of 10th century nuclear deterrence. They didn't have to explain the chemistry, they just had to point at the horizon. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines ever actually gifted a siphon to an ally. The consensus is a hard no. To give away a siphon was to give away the empire's life insurance. Even when their closest allies begged for the technology, the Byzantines would offer gold, silk, or even imperial titles, anything but the fire. You watch as the emperor grants an audience to a group of Frankish knights. They are physically imposing, covered in mail and scars, but as the firemasters walk past in their ceremonial robes, you see the knights instinctively step back. The Byzantines played on this barbarian superstition. They cultivated an image of themselves as the keepers of ancient, forbidden Roman magic. It was a way to compensate for their shrinking land armies. If you can convince the world you can set the ocean on fire, you don't need 1,000,000 men-at-arms. You remember that crocodile dung joke to a sophisticated Byzantine diplomat? That kind of primitive thinking was exactly what they wanted to encourage in their enemies. The more the world believed the fire was magic, the less likely they were to try and solve it with science. There is a fringe theory that the Byzantines actually used fake siphons on their merchant ships' wooden props painted to look like bronze to deter pirates. Imagine a pirate ship closing in, only to see a lion's head nozzle turn toward them. They wouldn't wait to see if it actually worked. They'd turn and run. This diplomacy of the bluff saved countless lives and protected the empire's trade routes. However, it only worked because everyone knew that the real fire was out there somewhere. You realize that the horror show was a brand, and the Byzantines were world-class brand managers. Imagine being the diplomat tasked with explaining why the emperor could unshare the secret with a friendly king. You'd have to use the religious angle we talked about, earlier claiming the angel who brought the fire would strike down anyone else who tried to use it. It was a polite way of saying no while making the other person feel like they were being protected from a curse. Historians still argue if this refusal eventually led to the resentment that fueled the Fourth Crusade. When people are told they aren't holy enough to handle the fire, they eventually stop asking for the recipe and start looking for the match. You see a group of young palace pages practicing the art of theatrical fear. They are taught how to describe the fire to foreigners using specific, hyperbolic Greek words that suggest the fire is sentient and hungry. This wasn't just gossip, it was a state-sponsored script. The Byzantines understood that the idea of the fire was sometimes more useful than the fire itself. It kept the Pax Byzantina alive in regions where the empire hadn't sent a soldier in decades. As the sun sets over the Marmara, you see the silhouettes of the dromons patrolling the harbor. They aren't fighting anyone. They are just there, a constant, glowing reminder of the empire's technical edge. The diplomacy of fire was about maintaining the status quo through a shared international trauma. You probably wouldn't survive the political intrigue of the Great Palace, but you can appreciate the genius of a government that turned a chemical weapon into a lasting peace. The horror show was the foundation of Byzantine soft power. It allowed them to sit at the center of the world, surrounded by enemies, and still be the ones who dictated the terms. You realize that the fire in the pipes was the ultimate big stick of the Middle Ages. And as the envoys leave the city, their heads full of stories about burning water and screaming bronze, you know they are carrying the empire's best defense back home with them, a healthy, paralyzing fear. As the 11th and 12th centuries roll forward, the horror show encounters a new kind of audience, one that doesn't just fear the fire, but views it through a lens of extreme religious and cultural friction. You are now standing on the docks of Constantinople during the arrival of the First Crusade. The Western Knights, clad in heavy mail and fueled by a rugged, feudal code of chivalry. Look at the Byzantine dromons with a mixture of suspicion and awe. To a crusader from France or England, warfare is supposed to be an affair of horses, lances, and honest steel. They see the Greek fire as Byzantine magic, a cowardly and unchristian way to fight. This brings us to the Crusaders' terror. The mainstream historical fact is that the Western Europeans, or Latins, were profoundly unsettled by the Greek fire. In their chronicles, they often described the Byzantines not as fellow Christians, but as deceptive sorcerers. They couldn't understand how a liquid could burn on water, and they certainly didn't like the idea of a weapon that ignored their expensive plate and mail. Historians still argue whether the Crusaders' hatred of Greek fire was a genuine moral objection, or simply a case of technological envy. You probably wouldn't survive the cultural clash of this era. If you were a Byzantine technician trying to explain the chemistry of naphtha to a Frankish knight, he'd likely accuse you of heresy and reach for his broadsword. There is a quirky tidbit from the memoirs of Jean de Jonqueville, a chronicler of the Seventh Crusade. He describes the terror of seeing the fire launched from Perrier's catapults, and says it looked like a giant dragon flying through the air with a tail of light so bright that the night became as clear as day. He noted that every time the fire was launched, the Crusaders would fall on their elbows and pray to God for protection, believing that only divine intervention could save them from the liquid of the Greeks. This confirms that even centuries after its invention, the psychological horror show hadn't lost its edge. It still turned hardened veterans into trembling pilgrims. You notice a group of Venetian sailors, the middlemen of the Mediterranean, trying to get a closer look at the siphons on a dromon. Unlike the knights, the Venetians are businessmen. They don't care if it's unchristian, they want the recipe. But the Byzantines are as tight-lipped as ever. Historians still argue whether the Latins ever managed to capture a working siphon during their many cooperative ventures with the empire. Some fringe theories suggest that the fire of the Franks mentioned in later medieval texts was a crude attempt to copy the Byzantine formula, but it lacked the sticky resin and the sophisticated pressure pumps that made the original so deadly. Imagine being a Byzantine officer tasked with guarding these crusaders. You see them looking at your ships not as allies, but as targets for future plunder. The horror show was now being used to keep your friends in check. You remember that crocodile dung joke? The Crusaders were so ignorant of the science that they purportedly believed the fire was made from the blood of dragons or a mixture of demons, bile. The Byzantines did nothing to correct them. In fact, they probably encouraged the rumors. The more the Crusaders feared the sorcery of the Romans, the less likely they were to turn their swords against the city at least for a while. The tactical reality for the Crusaders was a nightmare. In the siege of Damietta, or during naval skirmishes in the Levant, they saw the siphons turn their transport ships into floating ovens. You see a knight staring at a piece of scorched timber, his face a mask of holy dread. To him, this isn't war, it's a preview of the fires of hell. This psychological disconnect is what eventually led to the deep-seated resentment of the Fourth Crusade. The West saw the empire as a hoarding dragon-rich, technologically superior, and possessing secrets that no Christian should have. Historians still argue if the Crusaders' encounters with Greek fire led to the development of the first Western incendiary. While they eventually used firepots, they never quite mastered the liquid part. They were stuck with primitive fireballs of pitch and straw, while the Byzantines were still operating 7th century jet technology. You realize that the Crusaders' terror was a mix of religious fear and industrial inadequacy. They were medieval men facing a post-classical reality they weren't ready for. As you walk through the Crusader camp outside the city walls, you feel the tension. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and unwashed wool. But when a dromon passes by in the harbor, everyone stops to look. The sea fire is a silent threat, a reminder that the city they've come to save is more than capable of erasing them. You probably wouldn't survive the political powder keg of this relationship. One wrong spark, and the Crusaders would stop praying and start attacking. The horror show had become a double-edged sword. It protected the empire from the West by creating a barrier of fear. But it also made the empire a target for those who wanted to steal its magic. You see a Byzantine firemaster polishing the brass lion on his ship, ignoring the glares from the knights on the shore. He knows what they do, that the fire doesn't care about your coat of arms or your vows to the Pope. It only cares about the mix and the pressure. And as the Crusader fleet prepares to sail for the Holy Land, they do so with a lingering look over their shoulders at the city that holds the flame. While the fire still roared in the 12th century, the embers were beginning to cool in a way the emperors couldn't see. As you move through the twilight of the Comnenian era, you start to notice a subtle decay in the horror show. This is the beginning of the mystery of the missing recipe. It wasn't that the fire suddenly stopped working. It was that the institutional memory required to produce it was fracturing. The mainstream historical fact is that by the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the frequency of Greek fire mentions in historical texts began to drop. The empire was losing its grip on the specific chemical territories in the east, and the centralized Magnara workshops were becoming victims of the city's internal political instability. You enter the workshops again, but the atmosphere has changed. The firemasters are older, and there are fewer apprentices at their heels. Historians still argue whether the secret was lost because of a missing ingredient or a missing process. Some suggest that as the empire lost control of the Crimean and Caucasian oil seeps to the rising Turkish and Italian powers, they had to substitute the high-grade naphtha with inferior localized resins. The result was a fire that was less liquid, more prone to clogging the siphons, and most importantly lacked that terrifying hydrophobic water-loving property. You probably wouldn't survive the frustration of a 13th century siphonator. You'd pull the lever expecting a dragon's breath, only to get a sputtering, smoky dribble that your own rowers have to dodge. There is a quirky tidbit about the hereditary curse of the secret. Some scholars believe that because the formula was never written down only, passed through oral tradition and Hansen demonstration, a single plague outbreak or a poorly timed palace coup could erase centuries of technical refinement. Imagine a master chemist dying in a street riot during the 1185 uprising, taking the exact ratio of quicklime to bitumen to his grave. This is the fragility of the elite in action. The Byzantines had made the secret so exclusive that they accidentally made it extinct. You see a technician desperately trying to consult an old encrypted scroll, but the key to the code was a phrase only the dead emperor knew. You notice that the dromons in the harbor are starting to look a bit neglected. The bronze siphons are pitted with salt, and the leather bellows are cracking. Historians still argue if the secret was stolen or if it simply drifted. The Mamluks in Egypt and the Rum Seljuks began using their own incendiaries, which some Westerners called Greek fire, but these were usually just firepots filled with simple oil and saltpeter. They lacked the sophisticated hydraulic delivery system that made the Byzantine version a true flamethrower. You remember that crocodile dung joke? By this era, the enemies of the empire were starting to realize the magic was fading, and they began to treat the siphons with more contempt than terror. There is a fringe theory that the Byzantines themselves intentionally suppressed the technology during periods of civil war to prevent rival emperors from burning the capital. This internal sabotage might have been the final nail in the coffin. If you don't use it, you lose it. You see a firemaster being ordered to dismantle a siphon because the treasury can no longer afford the specialized copper solder. required for the high-pressure pipes, the logistics we saw earlier have collapsed into a world of good enough and make do. It's a heartbreaking decline for a technology that once held the world at bay. Imagine the psychological shift in the city. The people still believe the holy fire will save them, but the men on the walls know the vats are half empty and the pumps are leaking. The horror show has become a hollow theater. You probably wouldn't survive the sinking feeling of standing on the ramparts during a siege, watching the liquid fire fail to ignite while the enemy laughs from their scaling ladders. It's the moment the myth dies, and it's more painful than the fire itself. Historians still argue whether the secrets survived in a diluted form until the final fall of the city in 1453. Some eyewitnesses to the 1453 siege claim to have seen Roman fire being used against the Ottoman wooden towers. But the descriptions sound more like primitive gunpowder or simple pitchbots. The jet siphon, the roaring lion of the 7th century, seems to have vanished into the mist of the 1200s. You realize that the missing recipe wasn't just about chemicals. It was about the loss of the scientific state that Kallinikos had helped build. As you walk through the silent, dusty halls of the Magnara, you see a discarded copper nozzle lying in a corner, its lion head covered in cobwebs. It's a ghost of a more powerful time. The secret wasn't stolen by a spy. It was stolen by time, neglect, and the slow, grinding death of an empire's resources. You feel the weight of 1,000 years of history pressing down on this one piece of metal. The fire is gone, and the dark is closing in. The horror show had a good run, but every show has its final curtain. The Byzantines had spent centuries guarding a flame that they eventually forgot how to light. You realize that technology is a living thing. It needs to be fed with resources, talent, and stability. When those go, the magic goes with them. And as you leave the workshop for the last time, the only smell in the air is the damp scent of the Bosporus, no longer seasoned with the sharp, exciting tang of naphtha. The tragedy of a fading secret is that the world doesn't wait for you to remember it, even as the technical manuals of the Magnara are gathering dust. The empire is forced into one last grand display of maritime defiance. This is the Battle of the Bosporus, a period where the psychological trauma of the fire leads to entire fleets surrendering without a shot, purely on the reputation of the dromons. You are standing on a ship that is more of a bluff than a weapon. It's the late 12th century, and a rebel fleet is challenging the central authority. As your ship pulls out to meet them, you notice that the siphonator at the prow looks nervous. He's adjusting a nozzle that hasn't been fired in 3 years. The mainstream historical fact is that by this era, the reputational power of Greek fire often outweighed its actual tactical presence. Because the formula was so rare, the Byzantines used it sparingly, but the fear of it was universal. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines purposefully leaked rumors that they had discovered a new, even more powerful version of the fire to keep their rivals at bay. You probably wouldn't survive the crushing anxiety of this Cold War at sea. You're standing on a wooden boat, hoping the guy across from you is more scared of your reputation than he is of your actual weapons. You watch as the enemy fleet composed of Italian mercenaries and breakaway Roman governors begins to waver the moment your dromon clears the harbor. They see the bronze lion's head glinting in the sun, and the rowers on the lead enemy galley literally stop mid-stroke. This is a psychological paralysis that has been built over 500 years of horror stories. It doesn't matter that your tanks might be half empty or your pump seals are dry. The memory of the sea fire is a ghost that haunts every sailor in the Mediterranean. Historians still argue if the Byzantines used smoke pots to simulate the priming of a siphon, creating a cloud of black soot that looked like the fire was about to erupt just to force a surrender. There is a quirky tidbit about the fire truce. In some naval skirmishes of this period, the enemy would send out a small boat under a white flag specifically to ask if the Byzantine ship was equipped with the liquid. If the answer was yes, the enemy would sometimes simply pay a fine and sail away rather than risk the horror show. It turned naval warfare into a high-stakes poker game. You probably wouldn't survive the embarrassment of being a Byzantine captain whose bluff was called. But for most of this era, the bluff held the Byzantine brand was still the strongest currency in the East. You notice an enemy captain through your looking glass. He's staring at your ship's prow with a look of pure, unadulterated dread. He's likely heard the stories of the Rus and the 717 siege from his grandfather. To him, that bronze tube isn't a piece of technology. It's a death sentence. There is a fringe theory that during these later battles, the Byzantines actually used water siphons that sprayed plain seawater at high pressure. From a distance, the spray looked like the naphtha stream, and the enemy would panic and jump overboard before they realized they weren't actually on fire. It's the ultimate gaslighting of the medieval world. However, when the bluff was called, the results were messy. Historians still argue about a specific engagement in 1203, where the siphons were finally used against the Venetian fleet. The fire worked, but it was thin. It lacked the roaring intensity of the 10th century mix. The Venetians realized the dragon was old and toothless, pressed the attack. This is the danger of a secret, that S being lost. Once the enemy realizes the magic is just chemistry on bad chemistry, that the psychological shield shatters forever. You see the Venetian galleys closing the gap, their sailors no longer flinching at the sight of the bronze lion. Imagine the desperation in the pump room. They are trying to build pressure with leaky valves, pushing a subpar mixture through a clogged nozzle. It's like watching a grand opera singer lose their voice mid-performance. You realize that the Battle of the Bosporus wasn't just about territory, it was a battle for the empire's soul. They were trying to prove to the world and themselves that they still held the lightning. Remember that crocodile dung joke? By this time, the Italians were likely laughing at such superstitions, having replaced their fear with a cold, calculating desire for the empire's wealth. As your ship is forced to retreat back behind the chain of the Golden Horn, you feel the shift in the wind. The horror show is over. The reputation that had kept the city safe for centuries has been spent. Historians still argue if a more aggressive use of the remaining fire could have saved the city during the Fourth Crusade. But the logistics and the secret were already too far gone. The fire that had once turned naval battles into horror shows was now just a flickering candle in a rising gale. You look at the siphonator, who is slowly covering the bronze lion with a heavy tarp. He looks like he's covering a corpse. The Battle of the Bosporus was the last time the world truly trembled at the sight of a dromons prow. From here on out, the sea would still burn, but it would be from normal fires, the fires of conquest and tragedy, not the specialized, technical fire of the Romans. As the sun sets over the broken docks, you realize that a weapon's greatest power isn't the damage it does, but the damage people think it can do. The Byzantines had lived on that interest for a long time, but the account was finally empty. The horror show had become a memory, and the Bosporus, for the first time in half a millennium, felt cold and indifferent to the Roman cause. The fire may have faded from the prows of the dromons, but its disappearance sparked a detective story that has lasted nearly 800 years. As you walk through the silent, looted remains of the palace libraries following the Latin occupation, you are witnessing the fall of the secret. The transition from the 13th to the 14th century is a period of profound technological amnesia. The mainstream historical fact is that by the time the Byzantine Empire was restored in 1261, the specialized infrastructure and the hereditary guilds of the firemasters had been scattered to the winds. The secret wasn't just a recipe. It was a state-sponsored ecosystem that could no longer be sustained by a bankrupt, shrinking city-state. Historians still argue whether the formula was truly lost in a single catastrophic event, or if it was simply rendered obsolete by the arrival of gunpowder. There is a fascinating scholarly debate over technological displacement. As cannons began to appear on the walls of Europe and the ships of the Mediterranean, the Byzantine siphon started to look like a relic from a different age. A cannon could strike from hundreds of yards away with a kinetic force that shattered hulls. A siphon required you to be within 50 yards, exposing your ship to a devastating broadside. You probably wouldn't survive the transition from the age of fire to the age of iron. The bravery required to close the distance for a liquid spray becomes a suicide mission when the enemy has primitive artillery. There is a quirky tidbit regarding the alchemy of gunpowder. Some early Ottoman and European chemists actually believed that gunpowder was just a dry version of Greek fire. They experimented with adding sulfur and naphtha to saltpeter, trying to find a bridge between the two technologies. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines themselves attempted to integrate gunpowder into their siphons, perhaps, using a small blast of powder to launch the liquid fire further. But the two technologies operate on fundamentally different physics. Gunpowder is an explosion of gas. Greek fire is a sustained, pressurized flow. The Byzantines, caught in their own traditions, may have simply failed to adapt to the new, faster-moving science of the Turks. You notice a discarded alchemist's notebook in the corner of a ruined villa. It contains sketches of siphons, but the notes are filled with desperate substitutions. If no rock oil, use boiled wine and thick pitch. This is the sound of a secret dying. It's the MacGyvering of a superpower. You realize that the fall of the secret was a slow, painful realization that the empire could no longer play God with the elements. There is a fringe theory that the secret was actually sold to the Mamluks of Egypt by a disgruntled Byzantine official, but the fire of the Saracens, seen in later crusades, was never as effective, suggesting that the pumping system, the mechanical half of the secret, was the part that truly vanished. Imagine the perspective of the last firemaster. He is an old man in a city that is being slowly swallowed by the Ottoman tide. He has the recipe in his head, but there are no coppersmiths left who can make the hypersure valves, and the trade routes to the naphtha wells are closed. He is a man with a key, but no door. Historians still argue whether the secret was intentionally taken to the grave as a final act of imperial spite. If the empire was to fall, its greatest gift would fall with it. You see him burning his own scrolls as the enemy ships appear on the horizon. A final small horror show to ensure his life's work never serves a foreign master. The shift to gunpowder changed the psychology of naval warfare forever. The sound of the siphon, that terrifying organic roar, was replaced by the sharp, mechanical crack of the cannon. The rain of fire became the rain of iron. You remember that crocodile dung joke? By the 1400s, armorers were more worried about the thickness of their steel plates than the vinegar on their hides. The sensory experience of war became colder, more distant, and less sticky. The intimacy of the liquid fire, the way it clung to the skin and the wood, was a relic of a more visceral time. There is a certain irony in the fact that we can't perfectly replicate Greek fire today. Even with all our modern chemistry, we are still guessing at the exact ratios of 7th century bitumen. The fall of the secret was so absolute that it turned a real, historical weapon into a myth. You see a group of Ottoman engineers examining a captured Byzantine siphon after the fall of a coastal fort. They eventually melt it down for bronze to make a cannon. This is the ultimate symbol of the transition. The beast-headed nozzle that once vomited fire is repurposed into a tube that vomits lead. As you stand on the crumbling seawalls, looking out at a harbor filled with Ottoman galleys, you realize that the horror show didn't just end, it evolved. The terror of the burning sea was replaced by the terror of the exploding wall. You probably wouldn't survive the 1453 siege, where the last remnants of Byzantine fire were used alongside the first massive Ottoman cannons. It was a clash of two different eras of destruction. The fire was the last gasp of the classical world's ingenuity, while the cannon was the first roar of the modern age. The missing recipe remains one of history's greatest what-ifs. If the Byzantines had held on to the secret and combined it with gunpowder, would the empire have survived? Or was the fire always destined to die with the culture that birthed it? You feel the cold wind coming off the Black Sea, no longer carrying the scent of sulfur. The secret is gone, buried under layers of ash and conquest. And as the last light fades from the domes of the city, you realize that some fires are so bright they simply consume themselves. The bronze siphons have long since been melted down into Ottoman cannons, but the ghost of the liquid fire did stay buried in the wreckage of 1453. As you move forward through time, leaving the medieval world behind, you start to see the DNA of the Byzantine nightmare appearing in the laboratories of the Industrial Age. This is the legacy of the Inferno. The mainstream historical fact is that the concept of a pressurized liquid incendiary weapon served as a direct conceptual ancestor to the modern flamethrower. While the specific recipe of Kalashnikovs was lost, the tactical realization that fire could be a directed, cohesive stream rather than just a localized hazard remained etched in the collective military. Consciousness of the West, you are now standing in a 20th century trench, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and cordite. You see a soldier hefting a device that looks shockingly familiar, a pressurized tank, a flexible hose, and a nozzle designed to spray a sticky, oily fuel. It's the Cherasiffin's great-grandchild. Historians still argue whether the inventors of the modern flamethrower, like Richard Fiedler in the early 90s, were consciously trying to replicate Greek fire, or if they simply arrived at the same engineering solution for a different kind of war. You probably wouldn't survive the realization that the horror show you witnessed in the 7th century has simply been updated for a world of concrete and steel. But the terror hasn't changed. only the fuel has. There is a quirky tidbit about the development of napalm during World War II. The chemists at Harvard who developed the gelatinous soap-into-gasoline mixture were well aware of the legend of Greek fire. They were obsessed with the sticky property the way the fire clings to surfaces and resists being extinguished by water. In a way, modern napalm is the final successful attempt to solve the riddle of the Magnor. It achieves through synthetic polymers what the Byzantines achieved through pine, resin, and bitumen. Historians still argue if the Byzantine's use of quicklime was a primitive version of the chemical additives we use today to make fuels self-igniting or water-reactive. You notice the psychological continuity. Just as the Arab sailors in 674 panicked at the sound of the thundering siphon, soldiers in the world wars described the hiss of a flamethrower as the most terrifying sound on the battlefield. It still targets the lizard brain. You realize that the legacy of the Inferno is primarily a psychological one. The Byzantines prove that fire is the ultimate area denial weapon. It's not just about how many people it kills. It's about making a specific piece of ground or sea completely uninhabitable for the human spirit. You remember that crocodile dung joke? In the modern era, soldiers have better protective gear, but the fundamental helplessness of being painted with liquid fire remains exactly the same. There is a fringe theory that the secret of Greek fire was actually rediscovered during the Renaissance by alchemists like Leonardo da Vinci, who drew sketches of fire-spouting maritime devices. However, these were never deployed on the same industrial scale as the Byzantine dromons. The legacy stayed largely in the realm of terrible ideas we hope no one actually builds until the 19th century. You see a transition in the 1800s where fireships were briefly reconsidered for coastal defense. But the arrival of ironclad ships and long-range torpedoes finally pushed the liquid spray into the specialized role of trench clearing. The horror show also lives on in our popular culture, from the wildfire in Game of Thrones to the various liquid flames of fantasy novels. The image of a green or neon-colored fire that burns on water is our modern way of processing the Byzantine secret. It has become a metaphor for technology that has gone to ferroweapons so effective it feels like a curse. Historians still argue whether our obsession with the lost recipe is actually a form of romanticizing a weapon that was, in reality, a gruesome way to die. We love the mystery of the secret, but we often forget the screams and the rigging that it produced. Imagine the perspective of a modern chemist looking at a Byzantine copper pipe. They see the limitations of the 7th century, the lack of high-grade steel, the reliance on manual pumps, but they also see a level of intuitive genius that is staggering. The Byzantines were doing fluid dynamics and fractional distillation by feel and tradition. The legacy of the fire is a testament to what a desperate society can achieve when its survival depends on outthinking its neighbors. You probably wouldn't survive the burn list of a modern incendiary, but you can appreciate the lineage that began with a Syrian refugee and a bronze lion. As you look at a modern naval vessel equipped with missiles that can strike from over the horizon, you realize that the dromon was the first ship to break the physicality of naval war. It wasn't about who had the strongest rowers or the heaviest ram. It was about who had the most advanced energy delivery system. The legacy of the Inferno is the move toward asymmetric warfare, where a smaller, technically superior force can humiliate a massive armada. The Byzantines were the first to master this, and every modern navy is still playing that same game. The sun sets over a museum display of ancient weaponry, the light reflecting off a replica of a handheld siphon. It looks small and primitive compared to the weapons of today, but you know the truth. You've seen it roar. You know that this little brass tube changed the map of the world. The legacy isn't just in the weapons we build. It's in the walls that still stand in Istanbul. Walls that would have fallen over 1,000 years ago if it were not for a few gallons of Wallamd oil. The fire is no longer a secret, but it is still a nightmare. The horror show has merely moved into the history books and the darkened corners of our imagination. You realize that while we can refine the chemistry and automate the pumps, we can never truly tame the primal terror of the flame. The Byzantine legacy is a reminder that once you let the dragon out of the box, you can never truly put it back. You can only hope you're the one holding the lever. We have reached the end of the line, standing on the cooling ashes of 1,000 years of history. 1. You are now a shadow on the walls of a crumbling Constantinople, looking out over a sea that no longer burns. The final ember of the Byzantine horror show isn't a blast of flame, but a silence that marks the end of an era. The mainstream historical fact is that during the final siege of 1453, the Byzantines possessed only a few remaining siphons and a critically low supply of the necessary chemicals. They were used in a final desperate attempt to burn the Ottoman wooden siege towers. But the sheer scale of the Sultan's army and the thunder of his massive cannons made the liquid fire feel like a relic of a forgotten world. The secret was no longer a shield. It was a ghost. Historians still argue whether the final secret was truly lost during the chaos of the city's fall, or if the knowledge simply became irrelevant in a world dominated by gunpowder and logistics. You probably wouldn't survive the heartbreak of that final night watching the last Byzantine dromons vessel that would have been a god of the sea 3 centuries prior being splintered by a single Ottoman cannonball before it could even get into siphon range. It was the moment the dragon finally died, not because it was defeated in a fair fight, but because the world had changed the rules of engagement. The sea fire belonged to the age of wood and ore. It could not survive the age of iron and smoke. There is a quirky tidbit from the final hours. Legend says that a few firemasters escaped the city on Venetian ships, carrying the last of the formula with them to Italy. This sparked a minor alchemy rush in the West during the Renaissance, but without the specific crude oil sources of the East and the state-funded infrastructure of the Magnara. The experiments produced only smoke and disappointment. Historians still argue whether some of the Greek fire recipes found in early modern manuscripts are genuine remnants of the Byzantine secret, or just clever forgeries designed to swindle gold from hopeful kings. You see the tragedy in it: a weapon that once saved empires, reduced to a parlor trick for charlatans. You look out at the Golden Horn one last time. The water is calm, the surface reflecting only the stars and the campfires of the conquering army. The horror show is officially over. The psychological trauma that once paralyzed fleets has been replaced by the cold reality of a new superpower. There is a fringe theory that the secret wasn't lost at all, but was intentionally destroyed by the last emperor, Constantine XI, so that it would never be used against his own people by their new masters. Whether it was an act of sabotage or a natural death of the craft, the result is the same. The fire is out. You realize that the horror show was never just about the fire. It was about the empire. It was the physical manifestation of Byzantine survival, a blend of ancient Greek science, Roman engineering, and an iron-willed belief in their own divine mission. When the empire died, the fire died with it, because the fire was the empire. You probably wouldn't survive the transition to the new world, where the ocean is just a trade route again, and the thundering beast is just a story told to frighten children. The liquid fire had become part of the city's mythology, a light that shone most brightly right before it was extinguished forever. The journey we've taken tonight through the smoke and the spray is drawing to its quiet close. As the final images of those burning dromons begin to fade, feel the weight of the centuries settling around you, heavy and soft like a velvet shroud. The roar of the siphons is now just a distant hum, no louder than the wind passing through the ruins of a palace. The sea is still. The orange glow on the horizon has cooled to a deep, peaceful blue, and the terrifying heat of the laboratory has been replaced by the gentle, cool air of the evening. You are safe now, far removed from the chemicals and the chaos, drifting on a tide of history that carries no threat. The secrets are all buried, the lions have stopped their roaring, and the great city is at rest. Let your mind wander away from the scorched wood and the sticky naphtha, focusing instead on the rhythmic lapping of the waves against a shore that hasn't seen a flame in a long, long time. The story is told, the fires are quenched, and the dragon has returned to its slumber beneath the deep, quiet waters of the Bosporus. Sleep comes now, as silent and certain as the mist that once hid the ghost ships of the Golden Horn.